After my wife returned from a 10-month affair ending in pregnancy, her family told me to be mature, accept the situation, and move on. What I did next shocked them all. My name is Frederick Holloway. I am 69 years old. I built a commercial real estate empire from the ground up, starting with nothing but a rusted pickup truck and a relentless work ethic. Before I detail how I dismantled the people who plotted to steal my life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe betrayal should always be answered with absolute justice. The discovery happened on a quiet Sunday morning. I found the plastic indicator buried beneath a layer of discarded makeup wipes in the master bathroom garbage bin. 2 bright pink lines marked the small window. I felt a visceral shock strike my chest, heavy and suffocating, but my hands remained perfectly still. I stood in the pristine quiet of my own home, processing the undeniable physical proof of a profound betrayal. Downstairs, the heavy oak front door opened and closed. Vanessa called out my name, her voice carrying a cheerful, melodic tune. She had just returned from a supposed 3-day spa retreat with her girlfriends. She walked into the master bedroom glowing with complete satisfaction, her skin radiant and her posture arrogant. She dropped her designer travel bag onto our bed and smiled at me. I walked silently across the room, carrying the plastic stick in my right hand. I placed the pregnancy test squarely on the center of the cold marble counter. I did not raise my voice. I simply waited for her to notice the object. Vanessa looked down at the marble counter. She gasped loudly, her hands flying to cover her mouth. In an instant, she dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor. She began to weep with a fabricated joy that belonged on a theatrical stage. She grabbed the edge of my trousers, burying her face in the expensive fabric. She cried out that this was a miracle from God, a blessing we had been desperately waiting for throughout our 5 years of marriage. She praised me repeatedly, her voice thick with fake emotion. She told me how grateful she was that a man of my advanced age could finally give her a child. She weaponized my 69 years against me in the span of a single breath, framing this impossible biological event as a testament to my enduring vitality. Vanessa looked up at me with tears streaming down her perfectly manicured face. She thanked me for making her a mother. She painted an elaborate picture of our future together, describing the luxury nursery she would build and the vast corporate legacy this unborn child would eventually inherit. She performed the role of the devoted, ecstatic wife, flawlessly leaning entirely into the assumption that my age had made me desperate for an heir, desperate enough to ignore basic biology and logic. Her crying was loud and highly dramatic, specifically designed to overwhelm any rational thought I might possess. She squeezed my hands tightly, telling me that our family was finally complete. She assumed her emotional performance would erase any shadow of suspicion. She assumed I was a foolish, tired old man who would blindly accept her miraculous narrative without a single question, eager to embrace the illusion of renewed youth. I stared down at her in absolute silence. I did not pull my hands away, nor did I offer her any comforting words. I simply observed the sheer audacity of her deception with clinical detachment. When her theatrical crying began to subside into deliberate sniffles, I stepped around her. I walked to the hidden wall safe located behind a framed painting in my expansive walk-in closet. I entered the numerical combination, the mechanical clicks echoing loudly in the quiet room. I retrieved a thick sealed medical file with the insignia of a prominent urology clinic printed clearly on the cover. I walked back to the bathroom and dropped the heavy file onto the marble counter directly next to her positive pregnancy test. I looked Vanessa straight in the eyes. I informed her that exactly 15 years ago, following the tragic passing of my first wife, I made a definitive medical decision. I underwent a complete and irreversible surgical vasectomy. I told her that the file contained every post-operative test result confirming my absolute sterility. I had never shared this piece of my medical history with her because it was never relevant to the corporate business arrangement our marriage had essentially become. I watched her dark eyes dart frantically from my calm face to the stacked medical records. I explained calmly that the odds of me fathering a child were mathematically zero. The certified documents resting on the counter were irrefutable proof that the life growing inside her belonged to another man. I stood over her, projecting decades of boardroom authority, waiting patiently for the cold reality of her shattered illusion to fully set in. I let the crushing silence fill the room, ensuring she understood that her manipulation had hit an impenetrable wall of facts. Vanessa stopped crying immediately. The tears vanished completely as if a mechanical switch had been flipped inside her brain. She stood up slowly, brushing the invisible dust from her bare knees. The mask of the joyful, miraculous mother dissolved instantly, replaced by a look of pure, cold calculation. Her face hardened into a severe expression of deep resentment. She did not bother to apologize for her blatant infidelity. She did not offer a single excuse or attempt to fabricate another desperate lie. Instead, she picked up her phone from the bedspread. She dialed a number right in front of me, never once breaking her defiant eye contact. She called her mother Loretta and her younger brother Javon. She spoke into the receiver with a sharp, commanding tone, instructing them to come to the estate immediately. She told her family that she needed backup to deal with a stubborn old man who refused to accept his blessings and move on with his life. She casually walked over to the bathroom mirror, adjusting her hair and wiping the remaining fake tears from her cheeks with a towel. She declared that I was going to accept this child whether I liked it or not, simply because she was legally entitled to half of everything I owned. She believed her family's aggressive intimidation tactics would quickly force me into submission. She believed the impending arrival of her mother and brother would frighten me into claiming another man's child to avoid a catastrophic public scandal. She severely underestimated the man she had married. She thought I was permanently cornered in my own home, but she had merely fired the opening shot in a corporate and personal war she was destined to lose completely. Less than 45 minutes after Vanessa made her phone call, the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the foyer. I opened it to find her mother Loretta and her younger brother Javon standing on my porch. They brushed past me without a single word of greeting, moving with the practiced entitlement of people who believed they owned the space they occupied. Loretta did not offer an apology or even a feigned expression of sympathy for the absolute devastation her daughter had just introduced into my home. Instead, she walked directly into my private study, dropping her heavy designer handbag onto my glass coffee table. She sank into my custom leather sofa, letting out a deep sigh of satisfaction, as if she had just returned from a long day of hard work. Without asking permission, she reached for the crystal decanter resting on my side table and poured herself a generous measure of my most expensive aged bourbon. She took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the amber liquid coat her throat before she finally looked at me. She commanded me to sit down and listen to reason. She stated with absolute conviction that I needed to accept this child without complaint. She had the extreme audacity to tell me that a man of my advanced age should simply be grateful that a vibrant younger woman had decided to stay with him this long. She framed her daughter's blatant infidelity not as a profound betrayal, but as a minor inconvenience that I was obligated to overlook in exchange for the distinct privilege of Vanessa's continued companionship. She demanded I sign the birth certificate immediately upon the child's arrival to prevent any embarrassing public scandals that might disrupt their comfortable lifestyle. While Loretta dictated her terms from the comfort of my sofa, Javon paced the perimeter of the room like a hungry predator evaluating a fresh carcass. He stopped in front of the massive stone fireplace, casually picking up a heavy bronze sculpture I had commissioned to commemorate the completion of my first major commercial high-rise. He tossed the heavy metal from one hand to the other, testing its weight, projecting a silent physical threat designed to intimidate me into rapid submission. When physical intimidation failed to elicit any visible reaction from me, Javon pivoted immediately to a far more destructive strategy. He leaned heavily against the stone mantel and stared at me with a cold, predatory smirk. He promised me that if I even attempted to contact an attorney to file for divorce, he would personally ensure my complete destruction in the public eye. Javon detailed a highly calculated blackmail scheme. He threatened to go directly to the local press and the dominant city media outlets with entirely fabricated stories of systemic abuse within my company. He promised to recruit disgruntled former employees and pay them to testify that I routinely exploited my construction workers, ignored critical safety regulations, and fostered a toxic, dangerous environment on every single job site. He spoke with the chilling confidence of a man who had already planned every single step of this extortion. He made it perfectly clear that truth was entirely irrelevant in the court of public opinion. He assured me that the mere accusation of corporate cruelty would be enough to trigger union strikes, void my active municipal contracts, and completely ruin the pristine reputation I had cultivated over a lifetime of honest labor. He demanded my absolute compliance, positioning his fabricated smear campaign as the guaranteed penalty for my defiance. Javon stepped away from the fireplace, setting the bronze sculpture down with a sharp, disrespectful thud that echoed sharply against the quiet tension in the room. He walked toward me, invading my personal space, attempting to use his height and youth to force me into submission. He leaned down and whispered that a public relations nightmare of that magnitude would completely eradicate the corporate legacy I had spent 40 years building. His words were precisely designed to strike at the absolute core of my identity. 4 decades ago, I possessed nothing but a rusted pickup truck, a box of heavily worn tools, and a relentless determination to carve out a place for myself in an industry designed to keep men like me out. I worked 16-hour shifts pouring concrete in the freezing rain and framing buildings under the blistering summer sun. I sacrificed my youth, my rest, and my physical comfort to transform that single failing truck into the largest commercial real estate development firm in the region. Every brick, every steel beam, and every skyscraper bearing my company logo was paid for with my own blood and sweat. Javon knew exactly how much my company meant to me. He weaponized my life's work against me, calculating that I would rather swallow the ultimate personal humiliation of claiming another man's child than watch my massive corporate empire crumble under the weight of a highly coordinated media scandal. He stood inches from my face, breathing heavily, entirely convinced that his extortion had trapped me in an impossible corner with no viable means of escape. He smirked fully, believing that a man who had sacrificed his entire life to build an untarnished legacy would surrender everything to protect it from a manufactured catastrophe. I did not raise my voice in anger or demand that they immediately leave my property. Confrontation is a useless luxury reserved for the foolish and the unprepared. I remained perfectly silent, absorbing every threat, every insult, and every demand with an impenetrable expression of calm detachment. I looked at Loretta, who was finishing the last drop of my expensive bourbon, and then at Javon, who was waiting eagerly for my capitulation. I simply offered them a slow, measured nod. I told them in a quiet, defeated tone that I needed to take a few days to fully process the massive weight of this situation. My calculated performance worked flawlessly. Believing they had successfully broken my spirit and secured their financial future, Loretta and Javon exchanged a triumphant glance and finally walked out of my study. I listened closely as the heavy oak front door clicked shut behind them. The moment their vehicle pulled out of my long driveway, my posture shifted entirely. I bypassed the master bedroom where Vanessa was resting and walked straight to my garage. I bypassed my luxury sedan and climbed into my discreet daily driver. I drove through the empty, darkened streets of the city, heading directly toward my towering corporate headquarters. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when I unlocked the secure glass doors of my executive suite. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. I sat in the darkness of my private office, powered on my encrypted terminal, and immediately began to inspect the restricted private ledgers of my real estate empire to see exactly how deep the betrayal truly went. I knew that a family capable of orchestrating such a vicious emotional extortion was also highly capable of executing a devastating financial ruin right under my nose. Less than 45 minutes after Vanessa made her phone call, the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the foyer. I opened it to find her mother Loretta and her younger brother Javon standing on my porch. They brushed past me without a single word of greeting, moving with the practiced entitlement of people who believed they owned the space they occupied. Loretta did not offer an apology or even a feigned expression of sympathy for the absolute devastation her daughter had just introduced into my home. Instead, she walked directly into my private study, dropping her heavy designer handbag onto my glass coffee table. She sank into my custom leather sofa, letting out a deep sigh of satisfaction, as if she had just returned from a long day of hard work. Without asking permission, she reached for the crystal decanter resting on my side table and poured herself a generous measure of my most expensive aged bourbon. She took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the amber liquid coat her throat before she finally looked at me. She commanded me to sit down and listen to reason. She stated with absolute conviction that I needed to accept this child without complaint. She had the extreme audacity to tell me that a man of my advanced age should simply be grateful that a vibrant younger woman had decided to stay with him this long. She framed her daughter's blatant infidelity not as a profound betrayal, but as a minor inconvenience that I was obligated to overlook in exchange for the distinct privilege of Vanessa's continued companionship. She demanded I sign the birth certificate immediately upon the child's arrival to prevent any embarrassing public scandals that might disrupt their comfortable lifestyle. While Loretta dictated her terms from the comfort of my sofa, Javon paced the perimeter of the room like a hungry predator evaluating a fresh carcass. He stopped in front of the massive stone fireplace, casually picking up a heavy bronze sculpture I had commissioned to commemorate the completion of my first major commercial high-rise. He tossed the heavy metal from one hand to the other, testing its weight, projecting a silent physical threat designed to intimidate me into rapid submission. When physical intimidation failed to elicit any visible reaction from me, Javon pivoted immediately to a far more destructive strategy. He leaned heavily against the stone mantel and stared at me with a cold, predatory smirk. He promised me that if I even attempted to contact an attorney to file for divorce, he would personally ensure my complete destruction in the public eye. Javon detailed a highly calculated blackmail scheme. He threatened to go directly to the local press and the dominant city media outlets with entirely fabricated stories of systemic abuse within my company. He promised to recruit disgruntled former employees and pay them to testify that I routinely exploited my construction workers, ignored critical safety regulations, and fostered a toxic, dangerous environment on every single job site. He spoke with the chilling confidence of a man who had already planned every single step of this extortion. He made it perfectly clear that truth was entirely irrelevant in the court of public opinion. He assured me that the mere accusation of corporate cruelty would be enough to trigger union strikes, void my active municipal contracts, and completely ruin the pristine reputation I had cultivated over a lifetime of honest labor. He demanded my absolute compliance, positioning his fabricated smear campaign as the guaranteed penalty for my defiance. Javon stepped away from the fireplace, setting the bronze sculpture down with a sharp, disrespectful thud that echoed sharply against the quiet tension in the room. He walked toward me, invading my personal space, attempting to use his height and youth to force me into submission. He leaned down and whispered that a public relations nightmare of that magnitude would completely eradicate the corporate legacy I had spent 40 years building. His words were precisely designed to strike at the absolute core of my identity. 4 decades ago, I possessed nothing but a rusted pickup truck, a box of heavily worn tools, and a relentless determination to carve out a place for myself in an industry designed to keep men like me out. I worked 16-hour shifts, pouring concrete in the freezing rain and framing buildings under the blistering summer sun. I sacrificed my youth, my rest, and my physical comfort to transform that single failing truck into the largest commercial real estate development firm in the region. Every brick, every steel beam, and every skyscraper bearing my company logo was paid for with my own blood and sweat. Javon knew exactly how much my company meant to me. He weaponized my life's work against me, calculating that I would rather swallow the ultimate personal humiliation of claiming another man's child than watch my massive corporate empire crumble under the weight of a highly coordinated media scandal. He stood inches from my face, breathing heavily, entirely convinced that his extortion had trapped me in an impossible corner with no viable means of escape. He smirked, fully believing that a man who had sacrificed his entire life to build an untarnished legacy would surrender everything to protect it from a manufactured catastrophe. I did not raise my voice in anger or demand that they immediately leave my property. Confrontation is a useless luxury reserved for the foolish and the unprepared. I remained perfectly silent, absorbing every threat, every insult, and every demand with an impenetrable expression of calm detachment. I looked at Loretta, who was finishing the last drop of my expensive bourbon, and then at Javon, who was waiting eagerly for my capitulation. I simply offered them a slow, measured nod. I told them in a quiet, defeated tone that I needed to take a few days to fully process the massive weight of this situation. My calculated performance worked flawlessly. Believing they had successfully broken my spirit and secured their financial future, Loretta and Javon exchanged a triumphant glance and finally walked out of my study. I listened closely as the heavy oak front door clicked shut behind them. The moment their vehicle pulled out of my long driveway, my posture shifted entirely. I bypassed the master bedroom where Vanessa was resting and walked straight to my garage. I bypassed my luxury sedan and climbed into my discreet daily driver. I drove through the empty, darkened streets of the city, heading directly toward my towering corporate headquarters. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when I unlocked the secure glass doors of my executive suite. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. I sat in the darkness of my private office, powered on my encrypted terminal, and immediately began to inspect the restricted private ledgers of my real estate empire to see exactly how deep the betrayal truly went. I knew that a family capable of orchestrating such a vicious, emotional extortion was also highly capable of executing a devastating financial ruin right under my nose. The glow of the triple monitors illuminated the expansive mahogany desk, casting long, sharp shadows against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Holloway commercial development. I bypassed the standard executive dashboard, entirely executing a complex hard override to directly access the master servers containing the raw, unfiltered data of my life's work. The profound silence of the empty building amplified the rhythmic clicking of my keyboard as I dug deeply into the unredacted quarterly material budgets. For decades, my financial architecture had been an impenetrable fortress of logic and transparency, built on the absolute principle that numbers never possess the capacity to lie. Tonight, the numbers screamed of absolute treachery. I isolated the specific expenditure reports for our 3 largest active municipal projects, filtering the raw data by vendor authorizations over the past 10 months. The immediate discrepancies were visually staggering. Massive sums of liquid capital had been systematically bled from the core operational accounts, disguised flawlessly as inflated material costs for industrial steel and commercial-grade concrete. The sheer volume of the missing capital suggested a surgical extraction and inside job executed with an intimate, dangerous knowledge of our internal blind spots. I cross-referenced the physical inventory manifests against the digital invoices, finding massive gaps where premium materials were billed but never actually delivered to the construction sites. Whoever designed this theft understood exactly how to manipulate the automated auditing software I had implemented a decade ago. I stared at the glowing screen, feeling a cold, calculating fury replace the initial shock of my wife's pregnancy announcement. Vanessa had used the precise financial training I provided her to dismantle my company from the inside out. The betrayal was no longer confined to the sanctity of my marriage. It was a highly organized corporate assault designed to strip me of the very empire Javon had just threatened to destroy. I initiated a deep forensic trace on the final destination of the stolen capital, following the digital breadcrumbs deliberately hidden beneath layers of sophisticated accounting terminology. The fraudulent invoices were meticulously coded as expedited supply chain expenditures, bypassing the standard secondary review protocols through mandatory executive overrides. Every single one of these override commands bore the encrypted digital signature of my chief financial officer. Vanessa had systematically weaponized her executive clearance to authorize dozens of repeated high-yield wire transfers over the course of 10 consecutive months. I watched the screen intensely as the money flowed away from our primary holding accounts, funneling seamlessly into a third-party vendor entirely unknown to my procurement division. The entity was registered simply as Apex Supply Solutions, a supplier completely absent from our rigorously vetted corporate registry. I dug much deeper into the complex vendor profiles, pulling the specific routing numbers attached to the fraudulent invoices. Vanessa had constructed a flawless digital pipeline, moving hundreds of thousands of dollars out of Holloway commercial development and into a hollow corporate shell disguised as a critical infrastructure partner. She deliberately chose the busiest fiscal quarters to mask the missing funds, burying the massive withdrawals under the chaotic financial noise of our ongoing metropolitan expansions. I leaned back in my heavy leather executive chair, critically analyzing the terrifying brilliance of her parasitic strategy. She had not simply stolen cash to fund a lavish personal lifestyle. She had created an autonomous financial mechanism designed to continuously drain my company's lifeblood while projecting the absolute illusion of robust corporate health. The sheer discipline required to maintain this high level of theft over 10 months indicated a level of sociopathic focus I had completely failed to recognize in the woman sharing my bed. Apex Supply Solutions was not merely a random fake vendor. It was the financial weapon she intended to use to bury me completely. I immediately accessed the State Business Registry database, bypassing the standard public portals to pull the unredacted corporate incorporation documents for Apex Supply Solutions. I had originally promoted Vanessa to the powerful position of Chief Financial Officer specifically to ease my deliberate transition into semi-retirement, trusting her completely to protect the strict financial integrity of the empire, while I slowly stepped away from the daily operations. I handed her the master keys to my kingdom, genuinely believing her fierce ambition would serve to secure our family's future rather than dismantle my entire legacy. The secure database loaded the original legal filing documents for the shell company, clearly revealing the primary shareholder and the registered agent of record. The name printed in bold text on the legal filing struck my chest like a physical blow. Bradley was a mid-level, aggressively arrogant white contractor I had personally fired a year ago for gross negligence and severe safety violations on a major commercial build. I had publicly humiliated him, aggressively stripping him of his municipal credentials after his reckless corner cutting nearly collapsed a massive load-bearing structural wall. He had vehemently sworn to destroy my business as security forcefully escorted him off my property. Now his name sat boldly at the top of the Apex Supply Solutions Incorporation paperwork. The timeline aligned with devastating precision. The clandestine affair between my wife and Bradley had clearly begun shortly after his humiliating termination, evolving rapidly from a spiteful sexual betrayal into a highly calculated corporate conspiracy. Vanessa was not just having a foolish romantic fling with a younger man. She was actively conspiring with my most bitter industry rival, leveraging her unrestricted access to my wealth to rebuild the career of the man who had sworn to dismantle my life's work. The unborn child she claimed as a miracle was nothing more than the physical byproduct of their sinister alliance. Vanessa was actively and systematically funding her lover's hostile corporate resurrection, using the exact money I had bled to accumulate over 4 grueling decades. Bradley was utilizing my stolen capital to lease heavy machinery, bribe municipal inspectors, and aggressively re-establish his fraudulent footprint within the city limits, completely subsidized by the woman I had trusted with my life. I continued scanning the central ledger, thoroughly tracking the future financial projections, and scheduled automated actions exclusively tied to Vanessa's executive profile. I navigated to the highly restricted pending transactions tab, uncovering the final catastrophic phase of their joint conspiracy. Vanessa had hard-coded a massive, irrevocable automated wire transfer set to execute precisely on the first of the upcoming month. The scheduled transaction was specifically designed to completely bypass our standard security hold protocols, targeting the entirety of our primary operational reserve accounts. In exactly 10 days, the automated digital command would trigger, legally draining millions of dollars into Bradley's offshore holdings, leaving Holloway Commercial Development entirely paralyzed and fundamentally incapable of meeting payroll or continuing current construction projects. They were not merely stealing from the margins anymore. They were preparing for the absolute kill shot, intending to bankrupt my empire entirely while leaving me legally married to a pregnant traitor, utterly defenseless against Javon's impending media blackmail. I stared at the ticking countdown on the screen, a quiet, deadly calm settling completely over my mind as the sheer magnitude of their arrogance fully crystallized. They fundamentally believed my age and my impending public humiliation would paralyze me into complete submission. I did not attempt to cancel the pending transaction or foolishly alert the banking authorities. I closed the laptop smoothly, letting the bright screen fade to black, fully aware that surviving this monumental attack required a response so devastating they would never see it coming. I left my corporate office before dawn and drove directly to a dilapidated diner exactly 20 miles past the city limits. The neon sign flickered unreliably against the pre-dawn fog. Inside the diner was completely and entirely empty, except for my daughter Ebony and her husband Colin sitting in a corner booth. I slid into the faded, cracked vinyl seat across from them. I did not waste time with pleasantries or false comfort. I reached into my coat pocket and placed a heavily encrypted black flash drive directly onto the center of the scratched Formica table. I informed Colin that the drive contained the complete, unredacted corporate ledgers of Holloway Commercial Development covering the past 10 months. I told them that my wife had systematically breached my primary operational accounts, bleeding massive sums of liquid capital into an untraceable corporate shell. Ebony stared at me with an expression of quiet horror, her fiercely loyal eyes widening as the absolute severity of my words fully registered. She had always possessed my sharp instincts, and she instantly understood the catastrophic implications of an internal financial breach of this magnitude. I instructed Colin to utilize his specialized expertise to dissect the raw data. I needed to know the exact architectural framework of Vanessa's theft, and I needed the irrefutable digital proof secured before the sun rose. Colin nodded firmly, his demeanor shifting instantly into a mode of absolute clinical focus. He retrieved his secure laptop from his briefcase, plugged the drive into the port, and immediately began dismantling the complex digital barriers Vanessa had constructed. The silence in the diner thickened, broken only by the rapid clicking of his keyboard and the low hum of the refrigeration unit. I watched my son-in-law work, knowing the survival of my entire legacy now rested squarely on his forensic capabilities. Colin's eyes darted rapidly and with absolute precision across the cascading lines of data reflecting on his screen. As a senior certified forensic accountant, he possessed a lethal ability to identify deliberate numerical camouflage. Within minutes, he isolated the exact quarterly material budgets Vanessa had targeted. He pointed directly to the screen, explaining that she had deployed highly sophisticated routing algorithms designed to mimic routine vendor payments. These algorithms automatically fragmented the large wire transfers into hundreds of smaller, seemingly innocuous transactions, funneling them through a complex maze of regional proxy accounts before recombining them at their final destination. The sheer technical complexity of the theft indicated that Vanessa had outside assistance, likely from a specialized corporate hacker paid to build the digital infrastructure. Colin bypassed the superficial diversionary tactics, deploying his own aggressive countermeasures to peel back the layers of obfuscation. He meticulously tracked the fragmented funds as they bounced between multiple fictitious corporate subcontractors, watching the money stream consolidate into that singular shell company labeled Apex Supply Solutions. He noted that the automated nature of the algorithm meant the theft operated completely independent of human oversight once initiated. Vanessa had essentially built a financial parasite that fed continuously on our corporate reserves without triggering any internal audit alarms. Colin's fingers moved furiously as he isolated the ultimate offshore routing number tied directly to Apex. He initiated a brute force decryption sequence to break the final firewall protecting the account holder's true identity and physical location. The intense glow of the monitor highlighted the fierce concentration on his face. He assured me that he was mere moments away from exposing the complete financial anatomy of their conspiracy, stripping away the last remaining shield of digital anonymity Vanessa and Bradley had relied upon to execute their devastating betrayal. Ebony reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, her grip tight with intense, heavily suppressed fury. She looked down at the scratched table, taking a slow, steadying breath before revealing a deeply painful truth she had been forced to conceal. She confessed that exactly 4 long months ago she had seen Vanessa and Bradley sharing a quiet, highly secretive dinner at a secluded restaurant downtown. Ebony had immediately recognized the disgraced contractor I had publicly fired, and she observed them exchanging documents with an undeniable sense of conspiratorial familiarity. When Ebony approached their table and directly confronted Vanessa about the highly suspicious meeting, Vanessa had simply smiled mockingly and walked away without answering. The very next morning, Javon had suddenly appeared at Ebony's private accounting firm. He bypassed the main reception desk entirely and cornered her in the empty employee break room. Ebony recounted how Javon had backed her against the wall, delivering a meticulously prepared extortion threat. He promised her that if she spoke a single word to me regarding Vanessa and Bradley, he would completely destroy her life. Javon revealed that Vanessa had already planted fabricated financial irregularities within Colin's previous corporate audit files. He threatened to anonymously forward those forged documents to the federal authorities, framing Colin for massive corporate embezzlement. Javon assured Ebony that the ensuing federal investigation would guarantee Colin's immediate disbarment and result in a lengthy prison sentence, effectively ruining their family. Paralyzed by the terrifying prospect of her husband facing federal prison for crimes he did not commit, Ebony had been forced into an agonizing silence. She carried the heavy burden of that toxic secret entirely alone, watching helplessly as my wife actively plotted against me, bound by the vicious blackmail of a ruthless, opportunistic family. The laptop emitted a loud, decisive chime that instantly shattered the heavy emotional tension lingering in the diner. Colin leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the freshly decrypted data flooding the screen. He had successfully broken the encryption on the final routing number, completely exposing the operational core of Apex Supply Solutions. He turned the laptop toward me, pointing to the undeniable ledger entries. Bradley was not simply hoarding my stolen capital in offshore accounts to fund a lavish lifestyle. He was actively deploying the embezzled funds as immediate liquid collateral. Colin highlighted a massive, undeniable series of certified bank drafts issued by Apex and submitted directly to the City Planning Commission exactly 24 hours ago. Bradley was utilizing my own money to secure the mandatory financial bonding required to bid on the massive downtown waterfront revitalization project. It was the absolute largest municipal contract in the city's history, a monumental development I had spent over 3 grueling years preparing to win. Bradley was executing an aggressive hostile maneuver to severely undercut my company's official bid, using my stolen corporate wealth to artificially inflate his own financial standing. Vanessa had systematically drained my war chest to explicitly ensure that my fiercest rival possessed the exact capital required to defeat me in the highly competitive open market. They intended to steal the waterfront contract, publicly humiliating Holloway Commercial Development while simultaneously pushing my company into irreversible bankruptcy due to the impending automated account drain. The sheer scale of their combined treachery was staggering. They had built a weapon of total destruction using my own resources. I stared at the irrefutable evidence of their conspiracy, feeling a cold, absolute certainty settle in my mind. The time for silent observation had officially ended. It was time to construct the gallows. I left the diner just as the first cold light of dawn began to bleed across the horizon. I drove back to my estate in absolute silence, the heavy revelations of the night cementing themselves into a permanent, hardened resolve within my mind. When I finally pulled through the wrought iron gates and parked in the expansive circular driveway, I did not march into my home with the commanding stride I had cultivated over 4 decades in the cutthroat construction industry. Instead, I carefully orchestrated my physical return to perfectly match the precise expectations of my treacherous wife and her parasitic family. I deliberately rounded my shoulders, allowing my posture to sag, as if the sheer magnitude of the previous day's emotional extortion had physically broken my spirit. I walked through the grand foyer with a slow, labored shuffle, leaning heavily against the mahogany banister as I ascended the sweeping central staircase. I made certain my breathing sounded slightly ragged, projecting the fragile vulnerability of an aging man entirely defeated by circumstances beyond his control. I knew that Vanessa thrived on the absolute perception of dominance. By presenting myself as a shattered, compliant victim of her family's ruthless blackmail, I provided her with the exact illusion of total victory she desperately craved. She needed to firmly believe her psychological warfare had successfully neutralized any potential threat I posed to her grand design. My feigned physical decline became my ultimate defensive shield. It allowed me to move invisibly through my own home, hiding my razor-sharp calculations behind a carefully constructed facade of senile resignation. I reached the landing and shuffled toward the master suite, fully prepared to endure whatever manipulative theatrics she had prepared for the morning, knowing my silent performance was the absolute key to her impending destruction. Vanessa was waiting for me in the master bedroom, sitting gracefully in a plush velvet armchair near the bay window. She wore a pristine silk robe and held a steaming cup of herbal tea, projecting the serene image of a devoted, expectant mother. The moment I entered the room with my calculated, trembling shuffle, she immediately sprang into action. She moved toward me with an exaggerated display of deep concern, gently guiding me by the arm toward the edge of our massive, king-sized bed. She played the role of the caring, dominant wife with chilling perfection. She spoke in a hushed, soothing tone, assuring me that we were going to move past our ugly disagreement and build a beautiful future together for the sake of our unborn child. Once she positioned me comfortably against the pillows, her demeanor shifted slightly, adopting a firm, businesslike efficiency. She reached over to the polished oak nightstand and retrieved a thick, heavy stack of legally bound documents. She handed me a silver fountain pen and placed the dense paperwork directly onto my lap. She claimed with flawless casualness that the documents were merely routine insurance updates required by the private maternity hospital for the baby's upcoming arrival. She dismissed the staggering volume of the paperwork as standard bureaucratic red tape, urging me to quickly sign the highlighted sections so she could promptly deliver them to our healthcare provider by noon. Her eyes locked onto mine, silently daring me to question her authority or challenge her narrative. She stood over me, entirely confident that my broken, exhausted state would prevent me from exercising any basic caution, absolutely certain I would blindly sign away my life just to secure a brief moment of manufactured domestic peace. I held the thick stack of documents in my hands, keeping my expression entirely blank while my eyes scanned the dense, microscopic legal print. Vanessa fundamentally misunderstood the man she had married. Before I ever hired a single corporate attorney, I spent 20 grueling years personally negotiating every predatory commercial contract, zoning permit, and municipal lease required to build my empire from the ground up. My mind is permanently trained to dissect complex legal labyrinths and spot hidden clauses designed to trap the unwary. Beneath the superficial cover pages bearing the hospital's authentic logo, I immediately recognized the unmistakable structure of a comprehensive estate restructuring petition. Vanessa was executing a masterclass in financial disenfranchisement. The buried clauses were specifically drafted to completely sever my existing trusts and establish her and the unborn child as the absolute sole, irrevocable beneficiaries of my entire amassed fortune. She was legally attempting to completely erase my fiercely loyal daughter Ebony from my life's work. 30 years ago, holding my first wife's hand as she passed away in a sterile hospital room, I made a sacred vow to protect Ebony and ensure our hard-won legacy would permanently secure her future. Vanessa's fraudulent paperwork was a direct, vicious assault on that deeply personal vow. She intended to seize my real estate holdings, my liquid assets, and my controlling corporate shares the moment I was incapacitated or dead, leaving my only true child with absolutely nothing. I read the viciously greedy stipulations without allowing my hands to shake or my breathing to change. I understood instantly that confronting her about the deceit would only force her to find a more destructive avenue of attack. I needed to defeat the legal trap exactly where it lay. I uncapped the heavy silver fountain pen, ensuring my grip appeared noticeably weak and entirely defeated. I looked up at Vanessa, offering her a tired, compliant nod to fully sell the illusion of my complete psychological surrender. I lowered my gaze back to the fraudulent estate documents and began to sign my name across the bright yellow highlight markers. However, I did not provide my actual legal signature. Throughout my entire professional life, my official corporate and personal identity has been anchored by my legal name, Frederick Arthur Holloway. Every bank ledger, property deed, and municipal contract bore that exact specific sequence. With deliberate, practiced precision, I slightly altered the curvature of my handwriting. I boldly inserted the letter E as my middle initial across every single required signature line. I signed the paperwork as Frederick E. Holloway, applying this specific catastrophic legal flaw to all 32 pages of the binding agreement. In the strict realm of high-stakes estate law, a consistently incorrect middle initial on a document of this magnitude renders the entire petition completely null and void upon basic judicial inspection. It was an invisible, impenetrable sabotage. I finished the final page and let the pen drop onto the mattress, exhaling a long breath of manufactured exhaustion. Vanessa instantly snatched the thick stack of papers from my lap. She did not bother to review my handwriting, utterly blinded by her own ravenous greed and staggering arrogance. She clutched the voided documents to her chest, a triumphant, wicked smile stretching across her face as she falsely believed she had just successfully stolen my entire fortune. She spun on her heels and marched out of the master bedroom, completely unaware she was holding a stack of worthless paper. The secure boardroom at Holloway Commercial Development operated as an impenetrable fortress of acoustic isolation. I sat directly across the polished mahogany table from Mitchell, my corporate attorney for the past 22 years. Mitchell was a man entirely devoid of sentiment, operating purely on cold logic, legal precedent, and an absolute dedication to my corporate survival. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and meticulously examined the 32 pages of the estate restructuring petition Vanessa had forced upon me hours prior. The fluorescent overhead lights cast harsh, unforgiving shadows across the heavy legal documents as his sharp eyes scanned the microscopic print. The silence in the room stretched taut, punctuated only by the crisp rustle of high-grade paper turning under his fingertips. He reached the final signature line and stopped completely. A slow, deeply calculated smile broke across his otherwise impassive face. He looked up, tapping his expensive pen against the thick binding. He confirmed that my deliberate alteration of my middle initial rendered the entire contract legally void. Vanessa's aggressive attempt to irrevocably bind my liquid assets, my extensive real estate portfolio, and my controlling corporate shares to herself and her unborn child had failed the moment the ink dried. She possessed nothing but a heavy stack of completely worthless paper disguised as a monumental financial victory. Mitchell praised the precise execution of the sabotage, noting that her blinding greed had prevented her from engaging any outside legal counsel to verify the signatures. My tactical compliance had successfully neutralized her primary offensive strike without raising a single alarm. However, the temporary relief vanished instantly as Mitchell reached into his leather briefcase to extract a secondary, highly confidential file his investigative team had intercepted just before our meeting. The battlefield was expanding rapidly. Mitchell slid the newly extracted file across the polished table, his expression hardening into a mask of grim, professional urgency. He revealed that Vanessa had not relied entirely on the forged estate documents to secure her absolute dominance. She had quietly engaged a notorious boutique law firm specializing in hostile asset seizures to draft a formal petition for a medical conservatorship. I opened the file and read the damning legal framework. Vanessa intended to completely strip me of my legal autonomy by declaring me mentally unfit to manage my own vast financial empire. She cited fabricated instances of extreme memory loss, erratic professional behavior, and sudden cognitive decline, attributing these entirely manufactured symptoms to early-onset dementia. She had already secured 2 preliminary affidavits from questionable private physicians willing to testify to my supposed mental collapse without ever conducting a physical examination. Her strategy was breathtakingly vicious. If a sympathetic judge granted the conservatorship, Vanessa would immediately assume total unchecked control over my personal health decisions and every single corporate bank account tied to my name. She was actively building a legal cage designed to trap me in a permanent state of defenseless dependency. She planned to lock me away in a secure memory care facility the exact moment the child was born, silencing my authority permanently while she reigned over the empire I built. The sheer cruelty of her secondary plot demonstrated a profound level of sociopathic calculation. She was not merely attempting to rob me. She was actively plotting to erase my existence, entirely transforming me into a living ghost, permanently trapped within the sterile, locked walls of a psychiatric ward, while she funded Bradley's resurgence with my stolen wealth. The depth of her malice was absolute, solidifying my resolve to destroy her. Mitchell leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the mahogany table to emphasize the extreme critical nature of the impending timeline. He explained that Vanessa's aggressive push for the medical conservatorship was explicitly tied to the municipal waterfront project. She needed absolute, unquestionable control of my liquid assets before the city council officially closed the public bidding window in exactly 5 days. Her ultimate goal was to legally paralyze Holloway commercial development, preventing my executive team from submitting our counteroffer while simultaneously ensuring Bradley had unrestricted access to my capital to guarantee his victory. She was engineering a flawless corporate execution from the inside out. I absorbed the severity of the catastrophic threat without a single physical flinch. I reached into my tailored coat pocket and presented Mitchell with a weathered, heavily encrypted digital key. I revealed a deeply buried structural secret regarding the fundamental architecture of my wealth. 2 decades ago, immediately after recognizing the volatile nature of the commercial real estate sector, I established a completely dormant holding company registered under an entirely different state jurisdiction and a highly obscured legal framework. I had never utilized the entity, keeping it entirely invisible from all quarterly audits, tax filings, and internal corporate ledgers. Vanessa had absolutely no knowledge of its existence because the holding company predated her arrival at my firm by over 15 years. The dormant entity possessed the legal capacity to absorb limitless capital and physical assets without triggering standard federal regulatory alarms. I watched Mitchell's eyes widen in genuine professional admiration as he realized the absolute strategic superiority of this hidden sanctuary. It was the ultimate financial fail-safe, an impenetrable vault designed specifically for a catastrophic survival scenario exactly like this one. I instructed Mitchell to immediately mobilize his entire legal team and execute an aggressive total transfer of my corporate empire. He was to utilize the dormant holding company to draft an invisible, entirely impenetrable blind trust. I ordered the absolute liquidation of my name from every prominent asset, transferring the total ownership of Holloway Commercial Development, my vast private wealth, and every physical property I possessed directly into this newly formed trust. I named my fiercely loyal daughter Ebony as the sole irrevocable trustee, permanently locking my entire fortune behind a wall of legal steel that Vanessa could never breach. Mitchell typed furiously on his secure terminal, initiating the complex transfer protocols required to rapidly move hundreds of millions of dollars without alerting the standard banking surveillance algorithms. He paused, his hands hovering over the keyboard, and presented the final critical hurdle of our defensive strategy. To make the blind trust completely immune to any future marital litigation or probate challenges, the legal framework required one final, absolutely authentic signature from Vanessa. She needed to legally and voluntarily relinquish all current and future spousal claims to the assets being transferred. I stood up from the boardroom table, adjusting my jacket with a cold, absolute certainty. I told Mitchell to draft the relinquishment clauses and embed them deeply within a stack of seemingly mundane tax clearance forms. I knew exactly how to exploit my wife's blinding arrogance and her utter disdain for tedious administrative details. I would present the lethal documents to her during the lavish, chaotic family dinner Loretta was currently preparing to host at my estate. The ultimate trap was perfectly set, waiting only for the careless stroke of her pen to seal her absolute financial ruin. The following evening, the expansive formal dining room of my estate transformed into a theater of obscene celebration. Loretta usurped the role of hostess within my own home, commanding the household staff to serve a meticulously catered 7-course meal to commemorate the fraudulent pregnancy. She positioned herself at the immediate right of the head chair, a space she clearly believed she now rightfully owned. She demanded the staff open 4 bottles of my most exclusive vintage Bordeaux, pouring the dark crimson liquid into her crystal glass with reckless abandon. Her voice echoed sharply off the vaulted ceilings, entirely devoid of any refined restraint. She consumed the expensive wine with rapid, greedy gulps, her face flushing with the intoxicating thrill of unearned victory. Between massive bites of roasted duck, Loretta loudly broadcasted her grandiose plans for the unborn child. She dictated a specific timeline for elite private school admissions, boasting to the empty room about the generational wealth her daughter had permanently secured for their bloodline. She detailed the exact tuition costs of a prestigious international boarding school located in Switzerland, stating unequivocally that I would establish a fully funded educational trust before the month concluded. Her aggressive boasting served a dual purpose, functioning both as a vulgar display of her perceived triumph and a deliberate psychological weight designed to crush any remaining resistance I might harbor. I sat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, cutting my steak with slow, deliberate precision. I observed her gluttony without offering a single word of contradiction. The rich food and heavy wine fueled her staggering arrogance, blinding her completely to the cold reality of the trap closing tightly around her. She raised her glass to toast my immense generosity, entirely unaware she was celebrating her own impending absolute ruin. Javon sat directly across from his mother, matching her rapid alcohol consumption drink for drink. Emboldened by the vintage Bordeaux and the perceived success of his vicious blackmail scheme, his behavior devolved from subtle intimidation into blatant aggressive mockery. He leaned back in his velvet dining chair, crossing his arms over his chest, and stared directly down the length of the table at me. He laughed loudly, a sharp grating sound that cut through the classical music playing softly in the background. Javon looked me squarely in the eyes and called me a tired old dog, loudly declaring that my time running the pack was officially over. He stated that it was finally time for the old dog to be permanently put out on the porch, while the younger generation assumed total control of the estate. He mocked my quiet demeanor, interpreting my tactical silence as the pathetic surrender of a broken, senile man completely paralyzed by fear. He challenged me to defend my honor, practically begging me to raise my voice or show a single spark of righteous anger. I did not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I played the role of the compliant, utterly defeated provider flawlessly. I lowered my gaze to my plate, letting my shoulders slump forward, intentionally projecting the exact image of a man whose spirit had been entirely crushed beneath the weight of their extortion. I offered a weak, trembling nod of agreement, muttering a quiet apology for my lack of celebratory energy. My fabricated submission fueled Javon's inflated ego to dangerous heights. He poured himself another overflowing glass of wine, entirely convinced that his brutal psychological assault had permanently neutralized me. He believed I was a coward, completely blind to the fact that my silence was the heaviest weapon in the room. As the dessert course arrived, I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up from the table. I moved with a deliberate shuffling gait toward my private study, maintaining the illusion of physical exhaustion. I returned to the dining room carrying a thick stack of legal documents securely fastened to a heavy leather clipboard. I walked directly over to Vanessa, who was reclining comfortably in her chair, observing her family's vulgar behavior with a serene, triumphant smile. I placed the clipboard gently onto the table beside her half-empty wine glass. I spoke in a hushed, completely submissive tone, explaining that the documents were expedited tax clearance forms and urgent financial authorizations. I told her these specific signatures were legally required to immediately free up the massive cash reserves necessary for her planned luxury nursery renovations. This targeted explanation played perfectly into her established behavioral patterns. Over our 5 years of marriage, Vanessa had cultivated a meticulously documented history of highly frivolous spending, routinely demanding unrestricted access to capital for exorbitant interior design projects and unnecessary architectural modifications. She equated rapid financial expenditure with absolute emotional control. By framing these lethal trust transfer documents as the key to unlocking unlimited renovation funds, I actively weaponized her own obsessive materialism against her. I knew she would prioritize the immediate gratification of tearing down my master suite to build her nursery over the tedious task of reading dense legal terminology. I handed her my silver fountain pen, pointing with a slightly trembling finger to the bright yellow tabs marking the signature lines. I quietly urged her to complete the paperwork tonight, claiming the bank required the authorizations first thing in the morning to prevent any delays in her grand construction schedule. My voice carried the exact pathetic desperation of a man begging to please his captors. Vanessa snatched the silver pen from my hand with an eager, greedy swiftness. Blinded entirely by the intoxicating combination of vintage alcohol and her own unchecked arrogance, she did not bother to read a single paragraph of the dense legal text. She did not question the complex corporate letterhead or examine the binding relinquishment clauses explicitly detailed on every single page. She simply flipped through the thick stack of papers, rapidly signing her authentic, legally binding signature on every marked line. With each careless stroke of the pen, she legally and irrevocably surrendered all current and future spousal claims to my newly formed blind trust. She willingly forfeited her entire access to my corporate empire, my real estate portfolio, and my private wealth, trading her massive financial leverage for the childish illusion of immediate renovation cash. She forcefully shoved the completed clipboard back toward me, her eyes flashing with a dark, triumphant superiority. She ordered me to take the papers away and fetch another bottle of wine from the cellar to keep the celebration going. I nodded submissively, taking the clipboard and turning away from the table. As I stepped toward the hallway, my eyes caught a sudden bright flash of light illuminating the dark mahogany console table near the dining room entrance. Vanessa had left her personal iPad resting on the polished wood, the screen completely unlocked. A high-priority text message notification materialized across the digital display. I paused, reading the brief, damning text with absolute clarity. The message was from Bradley. He stated he was currently waiting for her in the guest house located on the far western edge of my property, demanding she slip away from the dinner immediately. My ultimate corporate rival was trespassing on my land, sleeping in my bed exactly as I needed him to be. The digital clock on my nightstand shifted silently to 3 a.m, casting a faint red glow across the empty space beside me in the master bed. Vanessa had slipped away exactly as Bradley had instructed, weaving a clumsy lie about pregnancy insomnia before vanishing into the dark night. I rose from the mattress, abandoning the facade of the frail, broken man entirely. I moved through the dark, silent corridors of my estate with the lethal precision of a predator hunting in familiar territory. The cold night air hit my face as I crossed the manicured lawn toward the guest house situated on the western perimeter. I bypassed the standard security keypad, utilizing a physical master key I had personally commissioned when the structure was originally built. The heavy oak door unlocked with a muted click, granting me unrestricted access to the site of my wife's ultimate betrayal. Inside the guest house was completely dark, save for the ambient moonlight filtering through the tall glass windows. I could hear the distinct rhythmic breathing of 2 people sleeping deeply in the master suite down the short hallway. The primitive urge to burst through that door and confront them violently roared in my chest, demanding immediate bloody satisfaction. I ruthlessly crushed that dangerous impulse. A chaotic emotional confrontation would merely alert them to my awareness and destroy the meticulously constructed legal trap I had just set in motion. True power lies in absolute discipline and the ability to strike when the enemy feels entirely secure. I ignored the bedroom completely, forcing my mind into a state of cold, clinical detachment. I pivoted away from the hallway, focusing my attention entirely on the main living area, searching for the physical tools Bradley was using to orchestrate his massive corporate theft. The soft, pulsing blue light of an active electronic device immediately drew my attention toward the marble kitchen island. Bradley had left his high-end workstation laptop resting casually on the polished stone counter, clearly possessing an absolute arrogant confidence in his total privacy within my own walls. I approached the machine, extracting a specialized, heavily encrypted extraction drive Colin had provided me earlier that evening. I tapped the spacebar, instantly waking the high-resolution monitor. Bradley's staggering incompetence manifested immediately. He had completely failed to engage any basic lock screens or password protections, leaving his entire digital ecosystem entirely unencrypted and completely vulnerable. I inserted the extraction drive into the primary port and swiftly bypassed the superficial operating system interface. I did not waste precious seconds scanning his personal correspondence or mundane operational emails. I dove directly into the deepest layers of his local hard drive, systematically hunting for the specific corporate files detailing his bid for the municipal waterfront project. The digital directories were chaotically organized, reflecting the sloppy, corner-cutting negligence that had originally forced me to terminate his employment. I navigated through folders labeled with generic, unassuming titles, deploying a rapid search algorithm Colin had preloaded onto my drive to isolate high-density architectural rendering files. The search program bypassed his basic operational spreadsheets and immediately flagged a massive, heavily modified directory buried deep within his personal archives. The folder was boldly titled with the exact municipal designation code for the upcoming waterfront revitalization contract. I opened the digital directory, my eyes narrowing as the screen flooded with dozens of complex computer-aided design files and highly detailed structural schematics. Bradley was not simply using my stolen capital to secure his financial bonding. He was actively hoarding a massive cache of highly classified technical data. Before I ever established Holloway Commercial Development as a dominant financial entity, I was fundamentally a master architect driven by a relentless passion for structural innovation. I built my empire not merely through aggressive corporate acquisitions, but through an unparalleled ability to envision and construct highly sustainable generational landmarks. The municipal waterfront revitalization project was meant to be my absolute crowning achievement, the definitive masterpiece of my 4-decade career. For 3 grueling, completely immersive years, I had personally drafted the foundational schematics for this specific city contract. I designed a revolutionary, entirely eco-friendly commercial complex, utilizing advanced solar-integrated glass kinetic energy harvesting systems and a fully self-sustaining water purification grid. It was an architectural marvel specifically engineered to permanently redefine the city's skyline while establishing an impossible new standard for absolute environmental sustainability. I had kept these groundbreaking designs locked within a highly restricted, heavily isolated internal server, shielding them from industry competitors until the official public municipal bidding window opened. I had poured my absolute soul, my decades of structural expertise, and my visionary foresight into every single microscopic detail of those complex blueprints. They represented my ultimate professional legacy, a physical manifestation of my life's dedication to building a significantly better future. Only a handful of elite executives within my inner circle possessed the necessary clearance to even view the preliminary sketches. I had entrusted Vanessa with the absolute highest level of administrative access, genuinely believing she respected the monumental scale of my creative vision. Instead, she had clearly recognized the immense, unparalleled value of my life's work and identified it as the ultimate asset she could violently strip away to guarantee her new lover's completely unearned, utterly fraudulent corporate resurrection within my own city, using my own genius. I opened the primary structural rendering file on Bradley's screen, my jaw clenching with absolute cold-blooded fury as the massive digital blueprint loaded. The image radiating from the monitor was not a brilliant new concept drafted by a rising competitor. It was my exact proprietary architectural design. Every single load-bearing calculation, every kinetic energy schematic, and every revolutionary environmental integration I had painstakingly authored over 3 years sat entirely exposed on his local drive. Bradley had not altered a single functional element of my genius. He had merely executed a pathetic, superficial manipulation, systematically deleting the Holloway Commercial Development insignias and replacing them with the hollow, fraudulent branding of Apex Supply Solutions. He was preparing to submit my stolen masterpiece to the city council, falsely presenting my revolutionary, eco-friendly design as his own original creation. The sheer audacity of this intellectual theft eclipsed even the massive financial embezzlement. The official city council vote to award the historic waterfront contract was permanently scheduled to occur in exactly 5 days. Vanessa and Bradley intended to lock me into a medical conservatorship, paralyzing my legal ability to submit my own authentic bid, while Bradley marched into City Hall holding my stolen legacy to secure his total victory. A dark, terrifyingly calm smile touched my lips as the true depth of their catastrophic miscalculation finally crystallized. I initiated the extraction drive, commanding the software to aggressively clone the entirety of Bradley's local hard drive. I mirrored every single stolen file, every forged document, and every digital communication directly onto my own heavily encrypted, entirely untraceable secure server. In exactly 5 days, Bradley would proudly present his stolen blueprints to the city council, entirely unaware that I held the detonator to his complete public destruction. I secured the cloned hard drive within my personal vault and watched the sunrise paint the city skyline I had spent my entire life building. By 8 o'clock in the morning, I was standing inside the sprawling marble atrium of City Hall. I had poured the very concrete beneath my feet decades ago, and I knew the intricate layout of the municipal building better than the elected officials who temporarily occupied it. I bypassed the crowded public reception area, entirely ignoring the long lines of anxious contractors waiting to submit their preliminary project bids. I walked with a heavy, purposeful stride directly toward the restricted executive elevators, projecting an aura of absolute, impenetrable authority that instantly silenced any questions. A young security guard stepped forward to intercept me, raising a hand to request my official credentials. I did not break my stride or offer a single word of explanation. I simply leveled a cold, unyielding glare at him, a look forged by 40 years of ruthless corporate dominance. The guard instinctively stepped back, lowering his hand and allowing me to pass unhindered into the restricted zone. I rode the elevator to the top floor, stepping out onto the plush carpet of the mayoral suite. The mayor's executive assistant scrambled to her feet, frantically stammering that His Honor was currently unavailable and strictly not taking unscheduled appointments. I ignored her frantic protests completely. I walked past her polished desk, grasped the brass handles of the heavy double doors, and pushed them open without knocking. I stepped into the private soundproof office of the city's highest elected official, bringing the cold reality of my impending vengeance directly to the absolute center of municipal power. The mayor looked up from his morning briefings, his face registering a fleeting moment of profound shock before swiftly transitioning into the practiced diplomatic smile of a career politician. I did not allow him the opportunity to offer a forced greeting or deploy his standard political pleasantries. I walked directly to his massive mahogany desk, reached into my tailored coat pocket, and dropped the heavy encrypted flash drive onto the polished wood with a sharp, resonant thud. I demanded he immediately lock his office doors and redirect all incoming communications. Once the heavy doors clicked shut, I instructed him to plug the extraction drive directly into his secure desktop monitor. I did not waste time with dramatic storytelling. I presented the raw, irrefutable data with brutal clinical precision. I displayed the complex financial routing algorithms Colin had isolated, clearly highlighting the massive flow of embezzled liquid capital moving from my primary corporate accounts directly into the fraudulent shell company registered to Bradley. I showed the mayor the undeniable banking certificates proving Bradley had utilized my stolen wealth to secure the mandatory financial bonding for the upcoming waterfront revitalization contract. Then I delivered the final devastating blow. I opened the architectural directories, projecting Bradley's officially submitted blueprints onto the large screen right next to my original time-stamped design files. I demonstrated exactly how Bradley had stolen my revolutionary, eco-friendly concepts, meticulously stripping away my corporate insignias and replacing them with his own hollow branding. The visual evidence was absolute and mathematically undeniable. I proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the city's most highly anticipated municipal bid was a complete fabrication, funded entirely by stolen money and built exclusively on stolen intellectual property. The mayor slumped back into his heavy leather chair, the practiced political color completely draining from his face as the sheer magnitude of the impending corporate scandal fully registered in his mind. He immediately shifted into an aggressive mode of bureaucratic damage control, desperately attempting to protect the fragile public image of his administration. He proposed a quiet, swift disqualification of Bradley's bid, suggesting we silently sweep the entire fraudulent submission under the rug to avoid a massive media spectacle right before the upcoming election cycle. He offered to discreetly award Holloway Commercial Development the waterfront contract behind closed doors, promising to make the entire problem vanish without a single public whisper. I slammed my hands flat onto his desk, leaning over the polished wood to completely shatter his cowardly illusion of a quiet resolution. I absolutely refused his pathetic offer of a silent settlement. I looked him dead in the eyes and forced him to remember a highly specific moment exactly 2 decades ago. Before he occupied this lavish office, he was a struggling, fiercely ambitious community organizer desperate to build a safe haven for underprivileged youth. I reminded him that I had personally funded the entire construction of his first community outreach center, providing the exact architectural foundation and the critical financial backing that effectively launched his entire political career. I had handed him the keys to his future without ever asking for a single favor in return. I told him that I was officially cashing in that decades-old marker of absolute loyalty. I was not asking for a municipal favor. I was demanding complete and total compliance with my specific terms of execution. I laid out the exact parameters of my demand with a terrifyingly calm, calculated finality. A quiet disqualification would simply allow Bradley to scurry back into the shadows and permit Vanessa to play the innocent victim of a bureaucratic error. I required a total, inescapable public annihilation of Bradley's professional and personal reputation, executed live in front of the entire city council, the regional press corps, and the most powerful financial figures in the state. I instructed the mayor to deliberately alter the strict parliamentary procedures governing the upcoming open bidding session scheduled in exactly 5 days. I demanded that he proceed with the public hearing exactly as planned, allowing Bradley to confidently step up to the podium and fully present my stolen architectural blueprints to the entire assembly. He was to let Bradley dig his own grave with every stolen word and every stolen concept. The moment Bradley concluded his fraudulent presentation, the mayor was to completely suspend the standard municipal protocol and grant me unrestricted, unrecorded floor time. I required the absolute, unchallenged authority to step into the center of the council chambers and deliver the kill shot directly to his face. The mayor stared at me, visibly shaken by the sheer ruthlessness of my strategy, but the heavy weight of his historical debt forced him into total submission. He slowly nodded his head verbally, agreeing to manipulate the official city schedule to accommodate my precise demands. The trap was now officially and irrevocably set. In 5 days, Bradley and Vanessa would walk into City Hall expecting to celebrate their monumental victory, completely unaware they were stepping onto a stage perfectly designed for their absolute public destruction. I left the mayor's office and immediately transmitted a secure encrypted authorization code directly to Colin. He was already waiting in a highly restricted off-site location, actively monitoring the complex digital flow of my corporate assets. The moment he received my cryptographic green light, he executed the final irrevocable digital command we had prepared. I sat in the back of my town car staring at my encrypted tablet as the live feed of the Holloway Commercial Development Master Ledger refreshed in real time. For the past 10 months, the parasitic algorithm Vanessa had installed had operated as a continuous silent bleed, siphoning thousands of dollars per hour into the Apex Supply Solutions shell account. I watched the specific line graphs representing those illicit outbound wire transfers suddenly and violently flatline. Colin did not merely pause the routing sequence. He completely obliterated the digital bridge connecting my operational reserves to Bradley's offshore accounts. He simultaneously engaged in aggressive corporate firewall, permanently locking the specific executive credentials Vanessa had been utilizing to bypass our standard dual authentication protocols. The financial pipeline was severed with absolute surgical precision. My wealth was now securely locked within the impenetrable blind trust controlled entirely by Ebony. Every single cent that belonged to my empire was instantly shielded from any external or internal manipulation. The silent theft had officially ended. Colin sent a brief 2-word confirmation message to my secure device confirming the complete neutralization of the Apex supply chain algorithm. The trap had effectively closed its jaws. My enemies were now operating completely blind, entirely cut off from their stolen lifeblood and blissfully unaware that they were already bleeding out. Precisely 45 minutes later, the first wave of consequences crashed into Vanessa's carefully constructed reality. She was sitting in the grand solarium of our estate, confidently managing her illicit financial empire from the polished screen of her personal laptop. Bradley had urgently requested an immediate injection of $50,000 to secure the absolute loyalty of 3 crucial municipal building inspectors. These aggressive bribes were the final necessary step to guarantee his stolen architectural bid passed the preliminary city council compliance checks without raising any regulatory red flags. Vanessa casually initiated the high-yield wire transfer, utilizing her top-tier executive clearance to authorize the massive movement of liquid capital. She clicked the final execution command, fully expecting the familiar green confirmation screen. Instead, the system flashed a harsh, glaring red error code. The transaction was instantly hard declined. Her confident smile faltered. Assuming a temporary glitch in the routing software, she rapidly refreshed the banking portal and aggressively attempted to force the payment through a secondary proxy server. The system rejected her credentials entirely, citing a critical security lockdown and an invalid authorization signature. A cold, creeping panic began to set in as she frantically pounded the keyboard, completely unable to access the very operational accounts she had freely drained for nearly a year. She attempted to access her own personal offshore reserve accounts, only to discover that the massive wealth she believed she had secured through the forged estate documents was entirely inaccessible. The screen stared back at her with unyielding finality, denying every single digital command she issued. Her ultimate financial weapon had been completely deactivated, leaving her entirely unable to fund Bradley's crucial municipal bribes. Driven by a toxic mixture of mounting terror and absolute entitlement, Vanessa stormed directly into my private home office. She slammed the heavy oak door shut behind her, her face flushed with frantic, barely contained rage. She marched up to my mahogany desk, demanding to know exactly why her top-tier executive credentials had been violently revoked, and why the primary corporate operational accounts were entirely frozen. I did not look up from the leather-bound architectural schematics I was reviewing. I slowly adjusted my reading glasses, maintaining the quiet, compliant demeanor I had so carefully cultivated. I looked at her with an expression of mild, confused exhaustion. I calmly informed her that our primary banking partners had unexpectedly initiated a mandatory, highly aggressive federal audit across all our municipal holding accounts. I explained that the bank's automated compliance software had flagged a series of unusual international routing patterns, triggering an immediate system-wide security freeze. This specific lie was meticulously engineered to paralyze her. Vanessa knew her entire theft relied on routing funds through complex offshore channels. By blaming a sudden federal compliance audit, I directly targeted her deepest fear of federal exposure, effectively weaponizing her own immense guilt against her. She stared at me, her eyes widening as the terrifying possibility of an impending federal investigation took deep root in her mind. I maintained my perfectly innocent facade, apologizing profusely for the sudden inconvenience and the temporary disruption to her luxury nursery renovations. She visibly struggled to control her breathing, desperately trying to mask her sheer panic behind a facade of annoyed inconvenience. She could not aggressively push for access without revealing her true desperation for the embezzled capital. I offered her a reassuring, completely hollow smile, gently explaining that the bank's senior compliance officers required exactly 48 hours to clear the mandatory security hold and fully reinstate our corporate liquidity. I assured her the funds were entirely safe and that this was merely a temporary bureaucratic hurdle. The strict 48-hour timeline I provided was a deliberate psychological torture device. It mathematically guaranteed that she and Bradley would possess absolutely no liquid capital during the critical countdown to the city council vote, completely neutralizing their ability to bribe officials or dynamically adjust their stolen bid. Before Vanessa could process the devastating implications of a 2-day financial blackout, the heavy doors of my office violently burst open. Javon stormed into the room in a state of absolute unhinged panic. The arrogant swagger he had displayed during the family dinner had completely evaporated, replaced by raw, visceral terror. He ignored his sister entirely, charging toward my desk with frantic, wide eyes. He grabbed the edge of the mahogany wood, hyperventilating as he revealed that every single massive check he had written to the independent contractors renovating Loretta's house had just violently bounced. The elite suppliers he had hired to install the exorbitant marble flooring and the custom-imported fixtures had immediately halted all construction. Javon was completely hysterical, his voice cracking as he confessed that the lead contractor was currently standing in Loretta's driveway, aggressively threatening to shatter Javon's legs if the hundreds of thousands of dollars in bounced checks were not immediately honored in physical cash. The absolute financial starvation of my empire had instantly severed their life support, and the ruthless wolves they had hired were already circling their door. Later that afternoon, the crisp autumn air did nothing to cool the suffocating tension gripping the estate. I walked out the heavy front doors toward the sprawling circular driveway, intending to survey the perimeter and mentally map out the next phase of my retaliation. Before I could even reach the driver's side of my town car, Javon ambushed me from the blind spot near the tall, manicured hedges. His earlier panic in my study had clearly metastasized into a violent, desperate rage. He no longer projected the arrogant swagger from the dinner party, nor the pathetic hysteria from his bounced checks. He looked like a cornered animal completely out of options. He closed the physical distance between us with aggressive, menacing strides, completely ignoring basic boundaries. Without uttering a single word of warning, he aggressively shoved a thick, unmarked manila folder hard against the center of my chest. The impact forced me to take a half-step backward against the cold metal of my vehicle. Javon's eyes were bloodshot, practically bulging out of his skull as he ordered me to open the file. He sneered, his breath reeking of stale alcohol and raw fear, declaring that my little bank audit excuse would not save me from the absolute destruction he held in his hands. He mistakenly believed my fabricated story about the frozen corporate accounts, assuming I was simply withholding the funds he desperately needed to pay off his violent contractors. He decided that if I would not willingly open the vault to save his legs, he would simply force the combination using ultimate leverage. I slowly opened the heavy folder, maintaining my perfectly composed, entirely detached demeanor, while staring down a desperate extortionist standing in my own driveway. The contents of the heavy manila folder revealed a highly coordinated and profoundly damaging setup. Inside lay dozens of high-resolution, time-stamped photographs taken under the cover of absolute darkness. The glossy images clearly depicted a fleet of heavy industrial transport trucks parked aggressively along the muddy banks of a protected regional river. Every single vehicle bore the unmistakable brightly illuminated logo of Holloway Commercial Development stenciled across its side panels. The photographs captured my company's designated transport crew actively discharging thousands of gallons of thick, viscous chemical waste directly into the pristine waterways. I flipped through the damning visual evidence, noting the specific license plates and the registered fleet numbers perfectly visible in the harsh glare of industrial floodlights. It was a completely undeniable visual record of a massive environmental atrocity directly linked to my corporate assets. Javon stepped uncomfortably close, tapping a thick finger violently against the most explicit photograph. He demanded an immediate, untraceable wire transfer of exactly $100,000 into a secured offshore proxy account. He dictated a strict, non-negotiable deadline of exactly 2 hours. He needed that specific amount of liquid cash instantly to silence the violent, independent contractors currently hunting him down for his bounced renovation checks. He snarled that if the required funds did not materialize in his account before the clock struck 5, the entire visual record of my company poisoning the municipal water supply would be anonymously leaked to every major news outlet and federal regulatory agency in the state. He thought he had successfully cornered a titan of industry, completely convinced that the sheer magnitude of the fabricated scandal would instantly force my hand and compel me to drain my last remaining reserves to buy his silence. Javon explicitly threatened to hand-deliver the original digital files directly to the regional directors of the Environmental Protection Agency. He leaned against the hood of my car, a vicious, mocking grin stretching across his face as he delighted in his perceived absolute leverage. He specifically targeted the core foundation of my professional legacy. Decades ago, I built the entire reputation of Holloway Commercial Development upon the absolute bedrock of strict environmental compliance and ethical construction practices. I had fiercely championed green initiatives long before they became corporate mandates, investing millions of my own capital into sustainable waste management programs and eco-friendly material sourcing. My pristine record had earned my company exclusive municipal contracts and prestigious federal grants, establishing me as a paragon of industrial responsibility. Javon laughed loudly, a sharp sound that echoed across the empty driveway, finding immense amusement in my impending total disgrace. He mocked the decades of grueling work I had dedicated to building an untarnished corporate image, taunting me with the promise of federal raids and devastating public protests. He detailed exactly how the EPA would aggressively dismantle my empire, imposing catastrophic fines and initiating criminal investigations that would permanently bury the Holloway name in disgrace. He reveled in the thought of watching the city turn against the man who had physically built its skyline. He completely misunderstood the profound reality of my operational control. He believed he was threatening a man terrified of losing a carefully curated public facade. He failed to comprehend that I personally designed the environmental protocols he was attempting to leverage against me, and I intimately knew every single operational safeguard protecting my fleet. His pathetic extortion attempt was fundamentally flawed. built entirely upon a scenario that my internal security systems would have instantly flagged and prevented before a single truck ever left the corporate depot. I ignored his incessant, frantic boasting and deliberately focused my absolute attention on the final pages tucked neatly at the back of the extortion folder. Beneath the glossy photographs lay a series of highly official chemical disposal manifests and municipal transit authorizations. These were the mandatory logistical documents required to move heavily regulated industrial materials across county lines. I studied the detailed paperwork with the cold clinical precision of a seasoned corporate auditor. The transport manifests explicitly authorized the nighttime dumping operation bearing the official Holloway Commercial Development corporate seal. I scanned down to the bottom right corner of the heavily stamped pages to locate the final executive approval. Staring back at me from the stark white paper was my own exact legal signature authorizing the catastrophic environmental breach. It was a flawless, masterful forgery. I analyzed the subtle pressure points and the precise curvature of the ink, instantly recognizing the specific stylistic tells. Vanessa had personally forged my exact signature on highly regulated federal transport documents. She had not simply allowed Bradley to borrow my fleet for a clandestine dumping operation to save money on proper disposal fees. She had actively and deliberately manufactured a massive federal crime, specifically engineering a catastrophic legal scenario to perfectly frame her own husband. She intended to use this forged authorization as her ultimate contingency plan, ensuring that if her medical conservatorship failed, I would be swiftly arrested and imprisoned by federal authorities for gross environmental negligence. I closed the thick manila folder, a dangerous, absolute calm washing over my entire body. My wife had meticulously built a federal cage designed to bury me alive. I looked up at Javon, perfectly ready to spring the jaws of the trap. He demanded his money, entirely unaware that he had just handed me the exact physical evidence required to guarantee Vanessa's permanent incarceration in a federal penitentiary. The digital clock on my nightstand shifted silently to 3 a.m, casting a faint red glow across the empty space beside me in the master bed. Vanessa had slipped away exactly as Bradley had instructed, weaving a clumsy lie about pregnancy insomnia before vanishing into the dark night. I rose from the mattress, abandoning the facade of the frail, broken man entirely. I moved through the dark, silent corridors of my estate with the lethal precision of a predator hunting in familiar territory. The cold night air hit my face as I crossed the manicured lawn toward the guest house situated on the western perimeter. I bypassed the standard security keypad, utilizing a physical master key I had personally commissioned when the structure was originally built. The heavy oak door unlocked with a muted click, granting me unrestricted access to the site of my wife's ultimate betrayal. Inside the guest house was completely dark, save for the ambient moonlight filtering through the tall glass windows. I could hear the distinct rhythmic breathing of 2 people sleeping deeply in the master suite down the short hallway. The primitive urge to burst through that door and confront them violently roared in my chest, demanding immediate bloody satisfaction. I ruthlessly crushed that dangerous impulse. A chaotic emotional confrontation would merely alert them to my awareness and destroy the meticulously constructed legal trap I had just set in motion. True power lies in absolute discipline and the ability to strike when the enemy feels entirely secure. I ignored the bedroom completely, forcing my mind into a state of cold, clinical detachment. I pivoted away from the hallway, focusing my attention entirely on the main living area, searching for the physical tools Bradley was using to orchestrate his massive corporate theft. The soft, pulsing blue light of an active electronic device immediately drew my attention toward the marble kitchen island. Bradley had left his high-end workstation laptop resting casually on the polished stone counter, clearly possessing an absolute arrogant confidence in his total privacy within my own walls. I approached the machine, extracting a specialized, heavily encrypted extraction drive Colin had provided me earlier that evening. I tapped the spacebar, instantly waking the high-resolution monitor. Bradley's staggering incompetence manifested immediately. He had completely failed to engage any basic lock screens or password protections, leaving his entire digital ecosystem entirely unencrypted and completely vulnerable. I inserted the extraction drive into the primary port and swiftly bypassed the superficial operating system interface. I did not waste precious seconds scanning his personal correspondence or mundane operational emails. I dove directly into the deepest layers of his local hard drive, systematically hunting for the specific corporate files detailing his bid for the municipal waterfront project. The digital directories were chaotically organized, reflecting the sloppy, corner-cutting negligence that had originally forced me to terminate his employment. I navigated through folders labeled with generic, unassuming titles, deploying a rapid search algorithm Colin had preloaded onto my drive to isolate high-density architectural rendering files. The search program bypassed his basic operational spreadsheets and immediately flagged a massive, heavily modified directory buried deep within his personal archives. The folder was boldly titled with the exact municipal designation code for the upcoming waterfront revitalization contract. I opened the digital directory, my eyes narrowing as the screen flooded with dozens of complex computer-aided design files and highly detailed structural schematics. Bradley was not simply using my stolen capital to secure his financial bonding. He was actively hoarding a massive cache of highly classified technical data. Before I ever established Holloway Commercial Development as a dominant financial entity, I was fundamentally a master architect driven by a relentless passion for structural innovation. I built my empire not merely through aggressive corporate acquisitions, but through an unparalleled ability to envision and construct highly sustainable generational landmarks. The municipal waterfront revitalization project was meant to be my absolute crowning achievement, the definitive masterpiece of my 4-decade career. For 3 grueling, completely immersive years, I had personally drafted the foundational schematics for this specific city contract. I designed a revolutionary, entirely eco-friendly commercial complex, utilizing advanced solar-integrated glass kinetic energy harvesting systems and a fully self-sustaining water purification grid. It was an architectural marvel specifically engineered to permanently redefine the city's skyline while establishing an impossible new standard for absolute environmental sustainability. I had kept these groundbreaking designs locked within a highly restricted, heavily isolated internal server, shielding them from industry competitors until the official public municipal bidding window opened. I had poured my absolute soul, my decades of structural expertise, and my visionary foresight into every single microscopic detail of those complex blueprints. They represented my ultimate professional legacy, a physical manifestation of my life's dedication to building a significantly better future. Only a handful of elite executives within my inner circle possessed the necessary clearance to even view the preliminary sketches. I had entrusted Vanessa with the absolute highest level of administrative access, genuinely believing she respected the monumental scale of my creative vision. Instead, she had clearly recognized the immense unparalleled value of my life's work and identified it as the ultimate asset she could violently strip away to guarantee her new lover's completely unearned, utterly fraudulent corporate resurrection within my own city using my own genius. I opened the primary structural rendering file on Bradley's screen, my jaw clenching with absolute cold-blooded fury as the massive digital blueprint loaded. The image radiating from the monitor was not a brilliant new concept drafted by a rising competitor. It was my exact proprietary architectural design. Every single load-bearing calculation, every kinetic energy schematic, and every revolutionary environmental integration I had painstakingly authored over 3 years sat entirely exposed on his local drive. Bradley had not altered a single functional element of my genius. He had merely executed a pathetic, superficial manipulation, systematically deleting the Holloway Commercial Development insignias and replacing them with the hollow, fraudulent branding of Apex Supply Solutions. He was preparing to submit my stolen masterpiece to the city council, falsely presenting my revolutionary, eco-friendly design as his own original creation. The sheer audacity of this intellectual theft eclipsed even the massive financial embezzlement. The official city council vote to award the historic waterfront contract was permanently scheduled to occur in exactly 5 days. Vanessa and Bradley intended to lock me into a medical conservatorship, paralyzing my legal ability to submit my own authentic bid, while Bradley marched into City Hall holding my stolen legacy to secure his total victory. A dark, terrifyingly calm smile touched my lips as the true depth of their catastrophic miscalculation finally crystallized. I initiated the extraction drive, commanding the software to aggressively clone the entirety of Bradley's local hard drive. I mirrored every single stolen file, every forged document, and every digital communication directly onto my own heavily encrypted, entirely untraceable secure server. In exactly 5 days, Bradley would proudly present his stolen blueprints to the city council, entirely unaware that I held the detonator to his complete public destruction. I secured the cloned hard drive within my personal vault and watched the cold morning sunrise paint the city skyline I had spent my entire life building. By 8 o'clock in the morning, I was standing inside the sprawling marble atrium of City Hall. I had poured the very concrete beneath my feet decades ago, and I intimately knew the intricate layout of the municipal building far better than the elected officials who temporarily occupied it. I bypassed the crowded public reception area, entirely ignoring the long lines of anxious contractors waiting to submit their preliminary project bids. I walked with a heavy, purposeful stride directly toward the restricted executive elevators, projecting an aura of absolute, impenetrable authority that instantly silenced any questions or objections from the surrounding staff. A young, inexperienced security guard stepped forward to intercept me, raising a hesitant hand to request my official credentials. I did not break my stride or offer a single word of explanation. I simply leveled a cold, unyielding glare at him, a look forged by 40 years of ruthless corporate dominance in a highly cutthroat industry. The guard instinctively stepped back, lowering his hand and allowing me to pass unhindered into the restricted zone. I rode the private elevator to the top floor, stepping out onto the plush carpet of the mayoral suite. The mayor's executive assistant scrambled to her feet, frantically stammering that his honor was currently unavailable and strictly not taking unscheduled appointments this morning. I ignored her frantic protests completely. I walked past her polished desk, grasped the heavy brass handles of the double doors, and pushed them open without knocking. I stepped into the private, soundproof office of the city's highest elected official, bringing the cold reality of my impending vengeance directly to the absolute center of municipal power. The mayor looked up from his morning briefings, his face registering a fleeting moment of profound shock before swiftly transitioning into the practiced diplomatic smile of a career politician. I did not allow him the opportunity to offer a forced greeting or deploy his standard political pleasantries. I walked directly to his massive mahogany desk, reached into my tailored coat pocket, and dropped the heavy encrypted flash drive onto the polished wood with a sharp, resonant thud. I demanded he immediately lock his office doors and redirect all incoming communications until we were finished. Once the heavy doors clicked shut, I instructed him to plug the extraction drive directly into his secure desktop monitor. I did not waste time with dramatic storytelling or emotional appeals. I presented the raw, irrefutable data with brutal clinical precision. I displayed the complex financial routing algorithms Colin had isolated, clearly highlighting the massive, ongoing flow of embezzled liquid capital moving directly from my primary corporate accounts into the fraudulent shell company registered to Bradley. I showed the mayor the undeniable banking certificates proving Bradley had utilized my stolen wealth to illegally secure the mandatory financial bonding for the upcoming waterfront revitalization contract. Then I delivered the final devastating blow. I opened the architectural directories, projecting Bradley's officially submitted blueprints onto the large screen right next to my original timestamp design files. I demonstrated exactly how Bradley had stolen my revolutionary, eco-friendly concepts, meticulously stripping away my corporate insignias and replacing them with his own hollow, fraudulent branding. The visual evidence was absolute and mathematically undeniable. I proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the city's most highly anticipated municipal bid was a complete manufactured fabrication, funded entirely by stolen money and built exclusively on stolen intellectual property. The mayor slumped back into his heavy leather chair, the practiced political color completely draining from his face as the sheer magnitude of the impending corporate scandal fully registered in his mind. He immediately shifted into an aggressive mode of bureaucratic damage control, desperately attempting to protect the fragile public image of his current administration. He proposed a quiet, swift disqualification of Bradley's bid, suggesting we silently sweep the entire fraudulent submission under the rug to avoid a massive, messy media spectacle right before the upcoming election cycle. He offered to discreetly award Holloway Commercial Development the waterfront contract behind closed doors, promising to make the entire problem vanish without a single public whisper or disruptive headline. I slammed my hands flat onto his desk, leaning over the polished wood to completely shatter his cowardly illusion of a quiet, convenient resolution. I absolutely refused his pathetic offer of a silent backroom settlement. I looked him dead in the eyes and forced him to remember a highly specific moment exactly 2 decades ago. Before he occupied this lavish office and commanded the city, he was a struggling, fiercely ambitious community organizer, desperate to build a safe haven for underprivileged youth. I reminded him that I had personally funded the entire construction of his first community outreach center, providing the exact architectural foundation and the critical financial backing that effectively launched his entire political career. I had handed him the keys to his future without ever asking for a single favor or concession in return. I told him that I was officially cashing in that decades-old marker of absolute loyalty right now. I was not asking for a municipal favor. I was demanding complete and total compliance with my specific terms of execution. I laid out the exact parameters of my demand with a terrifyingly calm, calculated finality. A quiet disqualification would simply allow Bradley to scurry back into the shadows and permit Vanessa to play the innocent, naive victim of a bureaucratic error. I required a total, inescapable public annihilation of Bradley's professional and personal reputation, executed live in front of the entire city council, the regional press corps, and the most powerful financial figures in the state. I instructed the mayor to deliberately alter the strict parliamentary procedures governing the upcoming open bidding session scheduled in exactly 5 days. I demanded that he proceed with the public hearing exactly as planned, allowing Bradley to confidently step up to the podium and fully present my stolen architectural blueprints to the entire assembly. He was to let Bradley dig his own grave with every stolen word and every stolen fraudulent concept. The moment Bradley concluded his presentation, the mayor was to completely suspend the standard municipal protocol and grant me unrestricted, unrecorded floor time. I required the absolute, unchallenged authority to step into the center of the council chambers and deliver the lethal blow directly to his face in front of a captivated audience. The mayor stared at me, visibly shaken by the sheer ruthlessness and absolute finality of my strategy, but the heavy weight of his historical debt forced him into total submission. He slowly nodded his head verbally, agreeing to manipulate the official city schedule to accommodate my precise, uncompromising demands. The trap was now officially and irrevocably set. In 5 days, Bradley and Vanessa would walk into City Hall expecting to celebrate their monumental victory, completely unaware they were stepping onto a stage perfectly designed for their absolute public destruction. While I left Javon sweating in the driveway, completely paralyzed by the reality of his bounced checks and the violent contractors waiting at his mother's house, another crucial phase of my retaliation was quietly unfolding inside my own estate. I had instructed my daughter Ebony to breach Vanessa's inner sanctum. Ebony arrived at the grand front entrance carrying a meticulously wrapped, exorbitantly expensive silver rattle, presenting it as a traditional peace offering for the unborn child. She played the role of the defeated, compliant daughter, flawlessly adopting a submissive posture that perfectly mirrored my own fabricated surrender. Vanessa, thoroughly bloated with her unchecked arrogance and entirely convinced of her absolute victory, eagerly took the bait. She believed my entire bloodline had finally capitulated to her extortion. Basking in the intoxicating thrill of her perceived dominance, Vanessa graciously opened the heavy mahogany doors and invited Ebony into the expansive, formal living room. She wanted an audience to witness her triumph. Vanessa paraded through the opulent space, her posture radiating the smug entitlement of a conqueror who had just successfully overthrown a kingdom. She wore a silk lounging robe purchased with my corporate funds, casually adjusting the fabric as she directed Ebony to sit on the imported Italian leather sofa. Vanessa believed this visit was a desperate plea for future financial mercy from a daughter terrified of losing her inheritance. She saw Ebony not as a threat, but as a conquered subject offering tribute to the new queen of the Holloway Empire. She was completely oblivious to the fact that Ebony was acting as my proxy, a highly trained operative stepping directly into the viper's nest to extract the final undeniable venom required to secure our total victory. Playing the role of the magnanimous hostess, Vanessa poured 2 crystal flutes of imported sparkling cider, handing one to Ebony with a condescending smirk. She settled into the plush armchair opposite the sofa, crossing her legs and taking a slow, deliberate sip. Emboldened by the sugary drink and her own inflated ego, Vanessa immediately abandoned any pretense of familial warmth and launched into a grotesque display of gloating. She openly boasted about her absolute unbreakable control over me, describing my quiet demeanor as the pathetic deterioration of a weak, senile old man completely broken by her strategic brilliance. She laughed, a sharp, chilling sound explicitly detailing the exact timeline of her endgame. Vanessa looked my daughter directly in the eyes and stated with terrifying bureaucratic detachment that I would be permanently removed from the estate the very second her child was born. She casually revealed her meticulously drafted plan to utilize the forged medical documents to forcibly commit me to a highly restrictive, locked memory care facility located 3 states away. She described the facility not as a place of healing, but as an inescapable prison designed to heavily drug me into a state of permanent drooling compliance. She boasted that she had already selected the specific institution because of its ironclad communication blackouts, guaranteeing that neither Ebony nor anyone else in my family would ever be permitted to contact me again. Vanessa spoke of my permanent incarceration with the casual indifference of someone discarding a broken piece of furniture, fully convinced that her legal and medical trap was absolutely flawless and utterly inescapable. She prided herself on having anticipated every legal countermeasure, eagerly explaining how the conservatorship would strip me of all basic human rights and hand her the total legal authority to dictate my medical treatments. The depth of her malice was entirely unmasked, laid bare in the quiet comfort of my own living room. The sheer cruelty of her medical conspiracy was merely the prelude to her ultimate financial strategy. Vanessa set her crystal flute down on the glass coffee table and enthusiastically detailed the final phase of her corporate hostile takeover. She openly confessed her intention to systematically dismantle Holloway Commercial Development the moment she secured full conservatorship over my assets. She explicitly named Bradley as the primary beneficiary of this destruction. She gleefully explained her legally binding plan to liquidate my life's work, transferring my massive real estate portfolio, my proprietary architectural patents, and my entire corporate infrastructure directly to Bradley's fraudulent shell company for absolute pennies on the dollar. She framed this massive illegal transfer of wealth not as a crime, but as a brilliant, untraceable mechanism to permanently wash my assets and secure absolute generational wealth for her new manufactured family. She boasted that my decades of grueling labor and structural genius would simply serve as the financial fertilizer for Bradley's unearned corporate resurrection. Every single damning word, every explicitly confessed felony, and every malicious detail of her conspiracy was captured with crystal clarity. Ebony sat perfectly still, maintaining an expression of quiet horror, while a high-fidelity military-grade audio recording device silently operated deep within the lining of her designer purse. I had personally integrated the transmitter into the leather fabric that very morning. Ebony did not interrupt or argue. She simply let Vanessa's monumental arrogance fuel an uninterrupted, legally admissible confession. Vanessa was freely handing over the exact digital ammunition required to secure federal indictments, completely blinded by her desperate need to assert dominance over my bloodline. She believed she was delivering a masterclass in ruthless corporate strategy to a defeated rival, never suspecting that her hubris was actively sealing her own fate in a federal penitentiary. Eager to provide a physical demonstration of her absolute conquest, Vanessa abruptly stood up and gestured for Ebony to follow her down the wide corridor toward the east wing. She proudly marched up to the heavy double doors of my private master suite, pushing them open with a theatrical flourish to show off her aggressive preliminary renovations. The massive room had been entirely stripped of its historical dignity. The antique mahogany furniture I had curated over 30 years had been shoved carelessly into the corners, scratched and damaged by reckless handling. But the true visual anchor of her disrespect lay scattered across the expensive Persian rug. Vanessa had gathered all of my personal belongings, my tailored suits, my private journals, and my irreplaceable family heirlooms, and unceremoniously stuffed them into cheap, heavy-duty black plastic garbage bags. She kicked one of the overstuffed bags aside with her slippered foot, cheerfully announcing that she was permanently gutting the entire suite to construct a massive interconnected luxury nursery and private playroom for Bradley's child. She was physically erasing my existence from my own home before I had even been removed from the premises. Ebony stood in the doorway staring at the garbage bags containing the sum total of my personal history and offered a slow, compliant nod. She quietly excused herself, claiming the emotional weight of the visit was simply too much to bear. Vanessa smiled a victorious, venomous smile, watching my daughter retreat toward the front door. The heavy lock clicked shut, and Ebony walked briskly down the driveway, the designer purse clutched tightly against her side. She had successfully extracted the ultimate undeniable proof of the conspiracy, securing the final weapon needed to permanently bury Vanessa beneath the crushing weight of her own hubris. Exactly 5 days after my initial meeting with the mayor, the highly anticipated municipal bidding session commenced. The atmosphere inside the Grand Council chamber was electric buzzing with the aggressive energy of high-stakes corporate warfare. Every polished mahogany bench in the gallery was packed to absolute capacity with members of the regional press corps, top-tier industry executives, and the most powerful political figures in the state. The room's heavy oak paneling and vaulted ceilings amplified the low, anxious murmur of anticipation as the city's financial future hung entirely in the balance. Bradley stood at the central polished podium, adjusting the lapels of his expensive tailored suit with an air of absolute unearned confidence. He looked out over the crowded gallery with the smug, sickening satisfaction of a man who believed he had successfully executed the perfect corporate coup. He casually arranged his glossy presentation materials, his posture radiating the arrogant ease of an undisputed victor. He had absolutely no idea that the financial lifeblood of his fraudulent company had been permanently severed days ago, or that his elaborate federal extortion plot had already spectacularly imploded. He was operating entirely on the intoxicating delusion of impending triumph, completely blind to the lethal legal trap closing tightly around him. The mayor sat at the elevated central dais, maintaining a perfectly neutral, statuesque expression as he formally pounded his heavy wooden gavel to initiate the morning proceedings. He called Bradley's fraudulent company Apex Supply Solutions to the floor to officially submit their final comprehensive proposal for the historic waterfront revitalization contract. Bradley cleared his throat, adjusting the microphone with a practiced, predatory smile, ready to proudly present the stolen masterpiece that would seal his ultimate irreversible destruction. Bradley launched into his meticulously rehearsed presentation with the polished charisma of a seasoned con artist. With a theatrical click of a remote, he illuminated the massive digital projector screen looming behind the mayoral dais. The entire chamber collectively gasped as the breathtaking, highly advanced architectural renderings flooded the room with vibrant color. He boldly presented my revolutionary, eco-friendly commercial complex, seamlessly guiding the captivated audience through the intricate, self-sustaining water purification grids and the advanced solar-integrated glass structures. He confidently rattled off the complex load-bearing calculations and kinetic energy harvesting metrics, reciting the exact technical specifications I had spent 3 grueling years perfecting. He claimed every single stroke of genius as his own brilliant, unparalleled vision for the city's future. The municipal council members leaned forward in their high-backed leather chairs, visibly mesmerized by the sheer, undeniable brilliance of the structural design. They nodded enthusiastically, furiously scribbling notes as Bradley promised a flawless execution timeline and a radically unprecedented standard for absolute environmental sustainability. When he finally concluded his presentation with a soaring, passionate pitch about building a generational legacy, the room erupted into a thunderous, unprompted wave of applause. Elite industry leaders murmured their profound admiration, completely unaware they were aggressively clapping for a brazen act of intellectual theft. Bradley stepped back from the podium, basking in the stolen glory, his face flushed with the ultimate high of securing the city's most lucrative contract. He turned a mocking, triumphant gaze toward where I sat in the front row, mistakenly interpreting my total silence as a pathetic, crushed surrender to his superior corporate maneuvering. As the applause finally subsided, the mayor raised his hand, deliberately interrupting the standard parliamentary procedure to award the contract. Following our strict predetermined agreement, he forcefully struck his gavel and officially called me to the central microphone, granting me unrestricted floor time. Bradley's arrogant smile instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp look of panicked confusion as I calmly rose from my seat. I walked to the podium with a slow, lethal deliberation, completely ignoring his presence as I physically pushed him aside. I connected my secure encrypted tablet directly into the city's primary projection mainframe. With a single decisive keystroke, I violently hijacked the massive screen. I did not bother with introductory pleasantries. I instantly displayed my original highly classified structural design files directly alongside Bradley's fraudulent submission. I zoomed in on the foundational schematic layers, forcefully highlighting the deeply embedded, heavily encrypted digital watermarks that Bradley's superficial manipulation had entirely failed to erase. I clearly displayed the rigid, irrefutable federal patent timestamps permanently registered to Holloway Commercial Development exactly 3 years prior to this morning's session. I methodically explained to the stunned council that the magnificent eco-friendly design they had just enthusiastically applauded was not a fresh innovation from a rising firm, but rather the stolen proprietary crowning achievement of my own 4-decade architectural career. I exposed Bradley's presentation as a massive deliberate act of corporate espionage, meticulously detailing how he had illicitly gained access to my isolated internal servers and crudely stripped my corporate insignias to falsely claim my genius as his own. The undeniable forensic data radiated from the giant screen, instantly transforming Bradley's triumphant masterpiece into a glaring, legally damning confession of monumental intellectual theft. The council chamber plunged into a suffocating absolute silence as the undeniable gravity of the crime settled over the room. Before Bradley could formulate a single pathetic syllable of defense or attempt to flee the podium, I executed the final sequence of my total retaliation. I accessed the secure server holding the data extracted from Vanessa and Bradley's clandestine operations. I maximized the audio output on the municipal sound system and pressed play. The crisp, high-fidelity recording of Vanessa and Bradley planning their theft echoed violently off the vaulted ceilings. Their own arrogant voices filled the chamber, explicitly detailing their coordinated conspiracy to steal my architectural blueprints, drain my corporate liquidity, and manipulate my assets to secure their unearned wealth. They openly bragged about laundering the embezzled funds to secure the municipal bonding, casually laughing about their flawless corporate heist. The entire gallery of reporters and industry elites sat frozen in pure shock, frantically recording the explicit confession of a massive multi-million-dollar federal crime unfolding live. Bradley stumbled backward against the mahogany podium, the remaining color draining from his face as he realized his absolute inescapable ruin. The heavy doors at the rear of the chamber suddenly swung open with a loud crash. 2 heavily armed federal marshals marched straight down the center aisle, their tactical boots echoing sharply against the marble floor. They bypassed the security barricade and flanked Bradley at the podium, violently wrenching his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs cut through the dead silence of the room. They officially placed him under federal arrest for gross corporate espionage, massive wire fraud, and grand larceny, marching him out of the chamber in complete disgrace as the press cameras flashed relentlessly. The sun broke across the sprawling grounds of my estate that Saturday morning, casting a warm golden light over a scene of absolute manufactured perfection. Vanessa had transformed the manicured gardens into a lavish spectacle of unearned opulence. 50 of the city's most prominent high society figures, women she had spent months desperately courting and bribing with my money, milled about the pristine lawns. They wore wide-brimmed hats and pastel designer dresses, sipping imported vintage champagne from crystal flutes, while white-gloved catering staff circulated with silver trays of decadent hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly near the customized floral archways, creating a serene, idyllic soundtrack that violently clashed with the absolute destruction I had already set in motion. Vanessa held court at the center of the sprawling patio, her hand resting delicately on her slightly swollen stomach, projecting the flawless image of a triumphant matriarch. She wore a custom-tailored silk maternity gown, radiating the smug, untouchable glow of a woman who believed she had successfully conquered an empire and secured her eternal reign. She was entirely oblivious to the catastrophic reality rapidly closing in around her. She did not know that her lover was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, entirely stripped of his stolen arrogance and facing decades in a penitentiary. She only knew the intoxicating thrill of her perceived victory, entirely consumed by the elaborate, expensive illusion she had built upon the fragile foundation of my stolen wealth. I watched the sickening display of excess from the second-floor window of my private study, maintaining my cold, clinical detachment. Every clinking glass, every hollow, sycophantic laugh floating up from the garden below merely served as the final pathetic overture to the absolute reckoning that was about to strike the estate. Down below, seamlessly navigating the sea of pastel dresses and tailored linen suits, Loretta paraded across the stone terrace with the obnoxious, aggressive swagger of a newly crowned queen. She held a fresh glass of champagne, her voice deliberately elevated to ensure every wealthy socialite within a 50-foot radius heard her boastful declarations. Loretta explicitly commanded the attention of 3 prominent local philanthropists, loudly detailing the massive generational wealth her brilliant daughter had officially secured for their family bloodline. She proudly announced that Vanessa was not simply bringing a new heir into the world, but actively seizing total operational control of the entire Holloway corporate empire. She spoke of my impending forced retirement as if it were a benevolent blessing, boasting that her daughter possessed the absolute legal authority and financial genius required to manage the massive estate and the corporate assets moving forward. Loretta gestured expansively toward the sprawling mansion and the acres of manicured land, obnoxiously declaring that this unparalleled level of luxury was the new permanent standard for their entire family. She reveled in the polite, uncomfortable nods of the high society guests, aggressively projecting a supreme sense of entitlement built entirely on a foundation of theft and betrayal. She drank deeply from her crystal flute, toasting to the brilliant future her daughter had engineered, completely unaware that the very ground she stood upon was about to be legally ripped out from under her expensive designer heels. She believed she had successfully elevated her family out of their miserable, parasitic existence and permanently embedded them into the city's elite ruling class. I observed her repulsive, arrogant performance with a steady, unblinking gaze, knowing that in exactly 1 hour, the county sheriff's department would violently shatter her delusion and physically padlock the luxury townhouse she mistakenly believed she owned. I turned away from the heavy glass window, silencing the pathetic noise of the garden party, and focused my absolute attention on the task at hand. I moved to the center of my study and calmly unzipped a single deeply worn leather duffel bag, placing it squarely on the surface of my mahogany desk. The distressed leather was heavily scarred, bearing the unmistakable physical evidence of decades of brutal, relentless labor. It was the exact same bag I had carried onto dusty, dangerous construction sites 40 years ago, when Holloway commercial development was nothing more than a desperate ambition and a pile of maxed-out credit cards. I had built an entire architectural empire from the absolute ground up, hauling blueprints, heavy steel measuring tools, and sheer uncompromising willpower inside this very bag. I systematically packed a few essential items, honoring the quiet, grueling origins of my legacy while mentally preparing to cleanly sever the toxic infection that had infiltrated my home. I did not need to pack the expensive tailored suits or the luxury watches Vanessa had attempted to throw into garbage bags. I was stripping away the superficial excess and returning to the cold, hard foundation of my own strength. Just as I buckled the heavy brass clasps of the weathered duffel, a violent, deafening crash shattered the quiet sanctuary of the room. The heavy oak door of my study flew open, slamming brutally against the wall. Javon stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a frantic, aggressive energy. The desperate panic from our previous encounter in the driveway had mutated into a volatile, explosive rage fueled by the mounting pressure of his violent creditors and his utter inability to force my compliance. Javon stormed directly into my private study, completely ignoring the basic boundaries of my sanctuary. He aggressively invaded my personal space, pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. He violently commanded me to abandon my pathetic isolation, ordering me to march downstairs immediately and perform the role of the proud, wealthy patriarch for Vanessa's high society audience. He snarled that my absence was becoming a glaring, unacceptable embarrassment to their family's moment of triumph. His voice dripped with raw, venomous malice as he explicitly threatened to physically grab me by the collar of my shirt and violently drag me down the grand staircase if I refused to comply with his demands. He mistakenly believed his physical intimidation could break my resolve, entirely convinced that I was still the frail, defeated old man, terrified of a public scandal. He needed me to stand beside his sister and validate their fraudulent victory, desperately hoping my visible submission would magically solve his own catastrophic financial ruin. I did not flinch, flail, or offer a single syllable of argument in response to his pathetic physical threats. I maintained my absolute impenetrable calm. I slowly reached across the surface of my mahogany desk and picked up a thick, heavy stack of sealed manila envelopes, each one containing the devastating, irrefutable legal documents that would permanently dismantle their entire existence. I secured the heavy leather duffel bag over my shoulder. Without uttering a single word, I deliberately stepped forward, forcing Javon to instinctively step back out of my path. I walked straight past him, carrying the physical instruments of their absolute destruction, and began my slow, methodical descent down the grand marble staircase, stepping into view just as the delicate string quartet below abruptly ceased playing. I reached the final marble step and strode purposefully into the exact center of the expansive, formal living room. The sudden silence from the string quartet caused a ripple of confusion among the 50 high society guests gathered on the adjacent terrace and spilling into the main hall. Heads turned one by one, adorned in wide-brimmed pastel hats, their eyes locking onto the weathered leather duffel bag slung over my shoulder. I stood perfectly still, projecting an aura of absolute unyielding authority that instantly commanded the attention of every single person in the room. The cheerful chatter died rapidly, replaced by a tense, palpable anticipation. Vanessa noticed the sudden shift in the atmosphere and immediately stepped forward from the patio doors, desperately attempting to control the narrative. She wore a strained, overly bright smile, entirely ignoring the heavy manila envelopes clutched in my hand. Operating on pure instinct and toxic arrogance, she quickly signaled a passing caterer and retrieved a fresh crystal flute of expensive sparkling cider. She turned to her audience of wealthy, influential socialites, raising the glass high in the air to preemptively neutralize any awkwardness my appearance might cause. With a loud, artificially sweet voice designed to project across the entire estate, she called for a toast to celebrate the arrival of her loving, incredibly generous husband. She painted a pathetic, manufactured picture of our perfect union, loudly declaring that none of this magnificent celebration or their future generational wealth would be possible without my endless devotion. She expected me to nod compliantly, to shrink into the background and play the role of the obedient, conquered patriarch she had so carefully constructed. She had absolutely no idea that I had just brought the executioner's block directly into her flawless, catered paradise. I did not return her manufactured smile or acknowledge the polite, scattered applause rippling through her audience of elite socialites. I maintained a posture of absolute freezing detachment, my expression entirely devoid of the warmth or submission she so desperately needed to validate her public performance. I stepped forward, closing the physical distance between us, and deliberately lowered the stack of heavy manila envelopes until the top one rested firmly against the rim of her raised crystal flute. I looked directly into her eyes, watching the arrogant triumph begin to flicker and crack under the crushing weight of my unwavering gaze. With a perfectly measured, deeply resonant voice that carried effortlessly across the sudden, breathless silence of the grand hall, I announced exactly what she was holding. I stated clearly and unequivocally that the envelope contained immediate, unchallengeable divorce filings, completely nullifying our marriage. I did not stop there. I raised my voice slightly, ensuring every single guest heard me declare the total, irrevocable disinheritance decree, stripping her of every financial asset, property claim, and corporate tie to the Holloway name. Before she could process the initial shock, I delivered the final, devastating legal blow. I explicitly announced the inclusion of a massive federal lawsuit for gross corporate embezzlement, fraud, and intellectual property theft, specifically detailing her illegal collaboration with Bradley. I informed her in front of the 50 wealthy women she had spent months desperately trying to impress that her lover was currently sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting arraignment for the exact crimes detailed in those documents. I stripped away her entire meticulously crafted illusion of power and generational wealth in a matter of seconds, exposing her as a common, desperate thief masquerading in silk maternity wear on my dime. The absolute shock of my declaration physically paralyzed Vanessa. Her fingers went entirely slack and the expensive crystal flute slipped from her grasp, plummeting toward the floor. The glass shattered violently against the imported marble tiles, sending a sharp, echoing crash through the paralyzed room and splashing sticky cider across the hem of her custom maternity gown. She stared at me with wide, horrified eyes, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound as the inescapable reality of her total ruin crashed down upon her. I completely ignored her pathetic state of shock. I pivoted smoothly on my heel, turning my attention directly to Loretta, who was standing frozen near the floral archways with her own champagne glass halfway to her mouth. I approached my mother-in-law, closing the distance with the same lethal, methodical precision. I extended the second heavy manila envelope, forcing it directly into her trembling hands. This package did not contain dry legal jargon or complex corporate filings. It contained a high-resolution electronic tablet already powered on, and actively streaming a live encrypted security feed directly from the front porch of her luxury townhouse. I instructed her to look at the screen. Decades ago, I had purchased that specific property outright, keeping the deed quietly in my own name simply to keep her toxic, parasitic influence far away from my primary residence. Now that absolute ownership was executing its final purpose. The live video feed clearly displayed a team of uniformed county sheriffs physically dragging her expensive furniture, her designer clothes, and her personal belongings out of the front door. They were unceremoniously dumping her entire life onto the public sidewalk while a locksmith aggressively drilled heavy metal padlocks directly into the front doors. Loretta stared at the brightly illuminated screen of the tablet, her eyes tracking the uniformed deputies as they callously tossed her velvet armchair onto the dirty concrete of the municipal sidewalk. A guttural, horrifying scream ripped through her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated devastation that shattered whatever fragile decorum remained in the elegant living room. She dropped to her knees right there on the marble floor, clutching the tablet to her chest, as she wailed in absolute agony, watching her unearned parasitic lifestyle vanish in real time. Javon, who had followed me down the grand staircase intending to enforce his earlier physical threats, froze near the bottom steps as his mother's desperate screams echoed off the walls. He looked from the shattered glass at his sister's feet to the live eviction footage playing in his mother's trembling hands. The devastating truth instantly slammed into his volatile mind. If my absolute financial retaliation had struck Loretta's property with such surgical immediate violence, his own identical luxury townhouse was undoubtedly suffering the exact same catastrophic fate. His bounced renovation checks and his violent unpaid contractors no longer mattered because he no longer possessed a home to run to. The realization of his total inescapable homelessness and complete financial annihilation pushed his already unstable mind completely over the edge. Blinded by a sudden, uncontrollable, and highly violent surge of adrenaline, Javon abandoned all rational thought. He let out a feral, aggressive roar, lunging toward a heavy, solid crystal vase resting on a nearby mahogany side table. He wrapped his thick fingers around the thick glass neck, hoisting the heavy weapon high into the air. With absolute murderous intent contorting his face, Javon charged directly across the room, aiming the crushing weight of the crystal straight for the side of my head. The heavy crystal vase sliced through the air, aimed directly at my skull with lethal, panicked momentum. I did not flinch or raise my hands to block the incoming strike, knowing my contingency plans covered every possible physical variable. Before Javon could cross the final few feet separating us, Colin materialized from the blind spot near the grand archway. My son-in-law moved with a sudden explosive velocity that completely defied the elegant cut of his dark suit. He did not shout a warning or attempt to de-escalate the volatile extortionist. Colin simply closed the physical distance in 2 rapid aggressive strides and intercepted Javon entirely mid-air. He dropped his center of gravity, driving his solid muscular shoulder directly into the center of Javon's sternum with absolute practiced precision. The sickening thud of bone connecting with bone echoed over the gasps of the terrified high society guests. The sheer kinetic force of the impact instantly stopped Javon's forward momentum, violently knocking the breath from his lungs and completely neutralizing his blind rage. The heavy crystal vase flew from his suddenly limp fingers, sailing harmlessly past my left shoulder to shatter violently against the base of the marble staircase. Javon gasped for oxygen that his paralyzed diaphragm refused to process, his eyes widening in sheer agony as the kinetic shockwave rippled through his entire torso. Colin did not pause to admire the devastating efficiency of his initial strike. He fluidly transitioned his momentum, leveraging Javon's sudden disorientation to completely dictate the physical encounter. The extortionist who had arrogantly threatened to drag me down the stairs by my collar just moments ago was instantly reduced to a gasping, powerless amateur caught in the iron grip of a highly trained operative. Colin clamped his hands onto Javon's tailored lapels, utilizing the desperate man's own remaining weight against him in a flawless, seamless tactical maneuver. With a sharp twisting motion, Colin violently slammed Javon flat onto the polished hardwood floor of the main hall. The heavy impact rattled the expensive crystal fixtures scattered throughout the opulent room, instantly extinguishing any remaining trace of Javon's pathetic rebellion. Before the stunned extortionist could even attempt to thrash or scramble away, Colin dropped his knee aggressively onto the space between Javon's shoulder blades, pinning him firmly against the floorboards. With terrifying mechanical efficiency, Colin seized both of Javon's flailing wrists and wrenched them sharply behind his back, locking the man's arms into a brutal, inescapable submission hold. Javon let out a high-pitched wail of pain, his cheek pressed awkwardly against the cold wood. Completely immobilized and thoroughly humiliated in front of 50 elite witnesses, Colin maintained his dominant, crushing posture without exhibiting a single sign of physical exertion. His breathing remained perfectly steady, and he did not break a single drop of sweat as he effortlessly neutralized the violent threat. He held the struggling extortionist down with the casual, detached demeanor of a man taking out the morning trash. The wealthy socialites crowding the patio doors stared in absolute frozen horror, their champagne flutes trembling as the illusion of Vanessa's perfect, untouchable family violently dissolved into a scene of raw physical domination. Colin shot me a quick professional nod, confirming the perimeter was completely secure. I adjusted my tailored jacket, stepping carefully around Javon's pinned, squirming body, turning my absolute attention back to the primary architect of this entire miserable conspiracy, standing frozen in the center of the room. As the terrified murmurs of the high society guests began to rise into a frantic crescendo, Ebony stepped forward from the shadows of the formal dining room, claiming the absolute center of the chaotic stage. My daughter carried herself with the lethal, unyielding poise of a corporate executioner, her designer purse resting casually on her arm. She completely ignored Vanessa's panicked, pleading gaze and walked directly toward the massive, state-of-the-art smart television anchoring the far wall of the living room. Moving with swift, practiced efficiency, Ebony wirelessly linked her encrypted smartphone directly to the primary home entertainment system. She did not bother to explain her actions or offer a single prefatory remark to the captive audience. She simply tapped the glowing screen of her device, routing the high-fidelity military-grade audio file she had covertly recorded in the master suite just an hour prior. Vanessa's own arrogant, venomous voice suddenly blasted through the synchronized surround sound speakers, echoing violently off the high ceilings. The recording explicitly broadcasted Vanessa gleefully detailing her meticulous strategy to falsely diagnose my mental capacity and forcibly lock me inside a highly restrictive remote psychiatric ward the very second her child was born. The crisp, undeniable audio captured every single cruel, calculated syllable as she gloated about erasing my existence, heavily drugging me into permanent compliance and stripping away my basic human rights. She proudly boasted about the ironclad communication blackouts she had arranged, guaranteeing I would rot in absolute isolation. The wealthy women standing in the garden, the very socialites Vanessa had spent a fortune trying to manipulate and impress, physically recoiled as the staggering depth of her sheer, unapologetic malice washed over the silent estate. Ebony did not allow the shock of the medical conspiracy to settle before delivering the final fatal strike to Vanessa's shattered public image. With another swift swipe across her screen, the television visually shifted, replacing the audio file with a glaring, brilliantly illuminated display of highly classified financial spreadsheets. The massive screen broadcasted the undeniable itemized ledgers, proving Vanessa had systematically drained my private corporate accounts to secretly fund Bradley's fraudulent commercial enterprise. Ebony methodically highlighted the massive illegal wire transfers and the forged executive authorizations, exposing exactly how Vanessa intended to liquidate my generational wealth and sell my legacy for pennies on the dollar to enrich her secret lover. A collective, audible gasp of absolute horror rippled through the sea of pastel dresses. The entire room instantly turned irrevocably toxic against the disgraced hostess. The elite women who had been toasting her brilliance just minutes ago now stared at her with visceral, unconcealed disgust, stepping backward to physically distance themselves from a confessed felon. Vanessa stood entirely isolated in the center of the spilled cider and shattered glass, frantically shaking her head and desperately stammering incoherent denials to an audience that had permanently turned its back on her. Her kingdom of lies had been entirely reduced to digital ash, as the crushing weight of her total social and financial annihilation settled into the dead silence of the room. A new, terrifying sound pierced the heavy atmosphere. The shrill, piercing wail of heavy municipal sirens erupted in the distance, growing rapidly and aggressively closer with every passing second. Vivid strobing flashes of aggressive red and blue lights began to bounce violently against the tall living room windows, signaling that the federal consequences of her arrogance had officially arrived at our front gates. The flashing red and blue lights violently strobed through the tall arched windows of the formal living room, casting harsh, erratic shadows across the frozen faces of the high society guests. The heavy oak front doors burst open instantly, shattering the suffocating tension that had gripped the estate. 4 heavily armed municipal police officers, closely flanked by 2 stern federal agents wearing distinct Environmental Protection Agency windbreakers, marched aggressively into the grand foyer. Their heavy tactical boots thudded against the imported marble, completely ignoring the scattered catering trays and the horrified gasps of the wealthy socialites who rapidly scrambled out of their path to avoid being associated with the incoming raid. Vanessa, entirely unhinged by the rapid collapse of her perfect illusion and desperate to regain control of the narrative, immediately launched into a frantic, hysterical performance. She aggressively pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, her voice cracking as she shrieked commands at the approaching officers. She demanded that I be arrested instantly, fabricating wild, desperate accusations of extreme emotional abuse and deliberate cruelty. She screamed that I had maliciously orchestrated this entire public spectacle simply to ruin her baby shower and torture a pregnant woman. She frantically tried to leverage the presence of her elite guests, insisting that I was a deranged, bitter old man acting out of pure spite and jealousy. She genuinely believed that her custom silk maternity gown and her meticulously curated victim persona would shield her from the incoming authorities. She expected the officers to immediately tackle me to the ground, entirely convinced that her tears and her manufactured outrage could override the federal warrants they carried. She stood amidst the shattered crystal of her broken cider glass, violently demanding my incarceration while remaining completely blind to the reality of the situation. The lead federal agent did not even glance in my direction. He walked with absolute unyielding purpose, stepping directly past my position and closing the distance to where Vanessa stood, screaming. He completely ignored her frantic theatrical demands and her weaponized tears, his face set in a mask of cold bureaucratic efficiency. Without a single word of preface or explanation, he firmly grasped her wrist, securing it behind her back as he loudly and methodically began to read her Miranda rights. Vanessa's hysterical shrieks instantly died in her throat, replaced by a suffocating, breathless gasp of pure terror as the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, binding her hands over her custom silk gown. The federal agent did not lower his voice to spare her dignity. He clearly announced the catastrophic list of federal charges directly into the dead silence of the room. He officially placed her under arrest for massive corporate embezzlement, gross corporate espionage, and the deliberate forgery of federal environmental transit permits. He explicitly stated that her co-conspirator Bradley was already in federal custody and had fully corroborated the digital evidence extracting the timeline of their massive municipal fraud. The absolute reality of her situation finally breached the thick walls of her delusion. She was not going to inherit a corporate empire or secure generational wealth. She was going to federal prison for orchestrating a massive multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. The elite socialites she had spent months desperately courting watched in absolute horrified silence as the woman who had just boasted about her supreme brilliance was publicly branded a common federal felon. Her meticulously constructed empire, built entirely upon stolen blueprints and forged signatures, evaporated into thin air right in front of the very audience she had assembled to witness her triumph. While the federal agents secured Vanessa, the municipal police officers moved swiftly across the room to relieve Colin of his captive. Colin effortlessly hauled Javon up from the hardwood floor by his collar, maintaining his iron grip on the extortionist's wrists before shoving him directly into the waiting arms of the arresting officers. Javon offered no resistance as the heavy handcuffs locked around his wrists, his volatile rage entirely extinguished by the crushing reality of his incoming incarceration. The lead officer loudly declared Javon was under arrest for felony extortion and blackmail, citing the specific time-stamped photographs and the desperate physical threats he had attempted to leverage against me in the driveway just days prior. Seeing her brother restrained and realizing the absolute totality of my retaliation, Vanessa deployed her final, most desperate contingency plan. She began to thrash wildly against the federal agent's grip, screaming at the top of her lungs that she was pregnant. She wailed that they were legally forbidden from taking her into custody, insisting that the stress of a jail cell would severely harm her unborn child, and demanding immediate medical transport to a private hospital. She tried to use the very child she had weaponized against me as a physical shield against federal prosecution. The lead agent did not soften his grip or offer a single ounce of sympathetic hesitation. He looked at her with a dead, unblinking stare and coldly informed her that federal holding facilities were equipped with fully staffed, highly secure maternity wards specifically designed to accommodate incarcerated felons. Her ultimate leverage was completely neutralized by cold, unforgiving bureaucratic protocol. She had manufactured this pregnancy to cement her control over my fortune, but it would not save her from facing the brutal consequences of her catastrophic greed. Loretta remained completely collapsed upon the imported Italian leather sofa, her body trembling violently as she wept with loud guttural sobs. She did not mourn for her daughter being hauled away in federal handcuffs, nor did she cry for her son facing severe extortion charges. She wept exclusively for herself. She stared blankly at the dark screen of the tablet still resting on the floor, fully comprehending that the county sheriffs had successfully padlocked her luxury townhouse. She had absolutely no home to return to, no stolen money to finance her parasitic lifestyle, and no family left to manipulate. Her entire existence had been violently erased, leaving her destitute and entirely alone in a room full of disgusted strangers. I did not pause to offer a parting word of advice or revel in the absolute destruction of their bloodline. I simply adjusted the strap of my worn leather duffel bag and turned my back on the wreckage. I walked steadily through the grand foyer, leaving the chaotic aftermath of flashing police lights and horrified socialites behind me. Mitchell was standing precisely at the bottom of the front steps, holding the open door of my waiting town car. I reached into my pocket, extracted the heavy ring of master keys to the estate, and dropped them directly into his open palm. I instructed him in a low, measured voice to ensure the catering staff cleaned up the broken glass before the new owners arrived. I calmly announced that I had legally finalized the sale of the entire estate to an anonymous cash buyer exactly 2 days ago. I stepped into the back of the vehicle, leaving the hollow, empty mansion behind to begin my life entirely unburdened. Exactly 6 months after the chaotic federal raid completely dismantled the elaborate, expensive illusion of my former estate, I found myself quietly sitting on the weathered wooden porch of a beautiful, deeply secluded cabin. The sprawling, ostentatious mansion with its imported marble floors and endless hollow rooms was a distant memory, willingly traded for the quiet, unpretentious serenity of a pristine lake surrounded by towering pines. The crisp, cool autumn air filled my lungs, entirely free of the suffocating, toxic ambition that had previously poisoned my daily existence. I rested in a heavy, handcrafted rocking chair, tracing the smooth grain of the wood with my fingertips as I listened to the gentle, rhythmic lapping of the water against the wooden dock. The sheer silence of this isolated sanctuary was not the heavy, oppressive silence of forced compliance or silent endurance that had dominated the past year. It was the rich, restorative quiet of absolute freedom and hard-won victory. The heavy burden of defending my legacy against parasites masquerading as family had been entirely lifted, leaving behind a profound sense of clarity and purpose. I watched a pair of loons glide effortlessly across the glassy surface of the lake, their movements smooth and undisturbed, mirroring the calm certainty that had finally settled into my own bones. The transition from the high society battleground to this rustic, natural retreat was a deliberate, necessary adjustment, a physical return to the grounded, authentic roots that had originally built the formidable Holloway commercial empire. I did not miss the sprawling, manicured gardens or the hollow, sycophantic praise of the city's corrupt, superficial elite. Sitting on that quiet porch, enveloped by the crisp forest air, I felt a deep, resonant connection to the reality I had successfully fought so ruthlessly to reclaim. Just a few yards away, near the edge of the stone fire pit, Ebony and Colin moved together in perfect, effortless synchronization as they prepared our quiet, celebratory evening barbecue. The thick, suffocating tension that had gripped them during the long, agonizing months of Vanessa's hostile corporate takeover had completely vanished from their posture. My daughter's face, previously hardened into a mask of relentless corporate warfare, was now bright and entirely relaxed. Her laughter carrying a light, carefree musicality that I had not heard since she was just a very young girl. She casually tossed a seasoned cut of meat onto the hot iron grill, playfully bumping her hip against her husband's side as he expertly managed the heat of the rising flames. Colin, stripped of his sharp, intimidating tactical suits, wore a faded flannel shirt and denim jeans, looking less like a lethal corporate operative and more like a man entirely at peace with his surroundings. The protective, hyper-vigilant stance he had maintained throughout the entire crisis had dissolved, replaced by a warm, unguarded affection as he leaned down to kiss Ebony's cheek amidst the rising smoke. Watching them share this simple, unburdened moment of domestic joy reinforced the absolute necessity of every harsh, calculating measure I had taken to secure their future. They were no longer fighting a desperate uphill battle against internal espionage or fending off the predatory greed of fraudulent family members. The toxic infection that had threatened to consume their marriage and destroy our shared legacy had been cleanly and permanently excised. The heavy, dark clouds of deception and betrayal had finally parted, allowing my daughter and her husband to breathe freely and build their lives upon a foundation of absolute, unshakable trust and genuine, unconditional emotional support. The sound of tires crunching against the gravel driveway signaled the arrival of Mitchell, who stepped out of his vehicle carrying a thin, leather-bound portfolio containing the final conclusive legal updates. He approached the porch with a satisfied, knowing smile, handing me the crisp documents detailing the ultimate, unavoidable consequences of my former in-laws' boundless greed. Vanessa had officially delivered her child while held securely within the heavily guarded, impenetrable walls of a federal medical penitentiary, permanently locked away from the luxury and status she had tried to steal. She was currently awaiting the formal execution of a mandatory, non-negotiable 5-year federal prison sentence for her central role in the massive embezzlement and wire fraud conspiracy, completely stripped of any access to my assets or public sympathy. Her partner in crime, Bradley, had suffered a similarly catastrophic fate, having lost his entire fraudulent company to aggressive, sweeping restitution claims before being transferred to a maximum security facility to serve a lengthy sentence for grand larceny and corporate espionage. The portfolio also contained a brief, pathetic update regarding Loretta. The arrogant woman who had once paraded around my estate, falsely boasting of generational wealth to elite socialites, was now permanently banished to the absolute bottom of the socio-economic ladder. She was currently employed at a minimum wage position sorting heavy damp clothes in a rundown 24-hour public laundromat on the city's outskirts. Without a stolen mansion to occupy or a wealthy son-in-law to relentlessly bleed dry, Loretta was living week to week in a cheap, dilapidated, and isolated roadside motel, her grandiose delusions permanently shattered by the harsh, unforgiving reality of her own making. Mitchell nodded quietly as I closed the portfolio, confirming that the lethal, surgical strike against the parasites was entirely and permanently complete. Every single dollar that Vanessa had illicitly siphoned from the corporate accounts had been meticulously tracked down, fully recovered, and legally placed directly into a secure, impenetrable, and heavily fortified trust fund, explicitly designated for Ebony's exclusive, unrestricted future use. The financial empire I had sacrificed decades to build was completely restored and permanently, ruthlessly insulated against any future parasitic infiltration. I leaned back into the comfortable rhythm of my wooden rocking chair, silently watching the vibrant, fiery colors of the setting sun reflect brilliantly off the calm, glassy, and undisturbed dark lake water. I reflected quietly on the long, grueling path that had ultimately led me to this moment of profound isolation and ultimate victory. I had never once raised my voice in a desperate scream. I had never raised my hand in a moment of uncontrolled, reckless, and impulsive violence. I had simply absorbed their relentless disrespect, enduring their cruel, calculated humiliations in absolute terrifying silence, while they foolishly and arrogantly believed they had finally conquered me. I had allowed their intoxicating arrogance to blind them completely, while I flawlessly mapped out the precise, inescapable architecture of their total, irreversible destruction. I had utilized their own toxic greed as the very weapon that dismantled their lives, turning their arrogant assumptions into the exact instruments of their downfall. I did not seek hollow emotional revenge. I simply and methodically adjusted the world back to its rightful logical reality, ensuring that every action met its equal and devastating inevitable consequence. As the final sliver of the sun dipped below the distant tree line, casting long, peaceful shadows across the quiet cabin porch, the deep, resonant peace I felt in my soul was absolute, permanent, and entirely, irrevocably my own. True power does not require loud declarations, aggressive posturing, or emotional outbursts to prove its absolute dominance over adversaries. The most effective retaliation is always executed in complete silence, utilizing patience and calculated precision to dismantle the very foundation of those who mistake kindness for exploitable weakness. When you allow greedy, arrogant individuals to believe they have secured an unearned victory, they will inevitably expose their deepest vulnerabilities. Restoring order demands a cold, unwavering commitment to truth and justice. Ultimately, protecting your legacy means ruthlessly excising toxic elements, ensuring that parasitic manipulation is met with permanent, devastating, and undeniable consequences. If you found this story compelling and satisfying, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know where you are listening from and what your absolute favorite moment of justice was.